has caused confusion and delay.
You have caused
Confusion and delay.
that is the pure face prejudice.
Daisy is just the ultimate thought. Daisy is just the ultimate thought.
Your impatience has caused confusion and delay. This storm has caused confusion and delay. You are causing confusion and delay. He has caused confusion and delay.
26 years old and you can't even drive? I can. Are you stupid, eh? Are you a stupid fool? Well, why can't you drive then? You can't even drive! Bit grey today.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another Deepest Law. We are continuing with the Francis Bacon theme, but don't call it a part 3, because it's not. It is a standalone stream. These are a series of standalone streams, isn't that right, D? It's not part 1, part 2.
Yeah, whatever you say.
Although I've noticed it's made absolutely no difference to the drop-off
No, it makes
rate.
no difference whatsoever. Yeah.
So, oh well. I don't know why that is.
It's something to do with human psychology, I think. You know, you gradually weed out all of the chat and until you're left with like 3 viewers.
I mean, in terms of kind of the quality of the viewership, I couldn't help but notice last night, and I'll just share this with you before we get on to Bacon. This is somebody time-stamping unpopular opinions at 0 seconds and 35 just to skip the intro music, and it had 5 likes. We live in an ADHD culture, D. Nobody can bloody who's got short attention span. So
My favorite thing is when they put the timestamp and it's literally like it's the end of the stream, you know.
yeah, I just want, like, I might just start indiscriminately deleting timestamps, you know. I just like, what are people doing? It feels like you're being when people leave random timestamps on the thing, it feels like they're trying to, like, I don't know, like, as the person on the stream, it feels like they're trying to pinpoint something that could be incriminating or something. You know what I mean? They're trying to, like,
yeah, I'm a bit suspicious of it. Yeah,
it's the sort of thing kind of leftists used to do when they were back in the SJW wars. You know, here's your clip out of context to show that you're a, you know, an ardent racist or something.
Yeah.
I mean,
you are you're inviting 10 people to do it.
Oh, of course they will. But then when it becomes an epidemic, I'll just indiscriminately, you know, we'll create a culture where we just don't have it anymore. So, yeah, and I will also say that, like, being a channel member does not give you immunity to bannings either. Because people getting very lippy these days, very lippy, and I'm just not prepared to take any lip at all. Alexander Adams, welcome to the show, sir.
Thank you very much. Diversity is our strength, comrades. I always remember seeing timestamps in the comments for YouTube audiobooks, because in the old days, cookies wouldn't remember where you finished listening. So if you were listening to an audiobook that was about 6 hours long, you'd have to stamp it sort of 3 hours and 13 minutes just to remind yourself where you'd finished. But there were obviously other reasons for doing it.
Yeah, I do. That is one little mod con quality of life thing that I do like, where it just remembers, your account remembers where you are, you know. Yeah. Anyway, I will just mention Dubai courses at the academic agency. The merit code is still just about going. I had to delay Unpopular Opinions last night to finally air that. Can you believe there are some people saying, oh, Jordan Peterson's version is better than yours? Why is that then? Oh, because basically it's so exclusionary that nobody understands what he's saying and makes him sound clever.
No,
Don't buy it.
I mean, to me, it just makes him sound like an idiot. But, you know, I may also use people's responses to that as an intelligence test, you know, because that is another. That's another thing that I've always had a kind of passionate distaste for is people who mistake, let's just say, an extensive vocabulary for intelligence. Whereas most of the time it makes you sound stupid. In fact, there's a really good Shakespeare scene where he makes fun of this. I'm trying to remember in fact, there's several characters who are constantly trying to make themselves sound clever by using big words and then getting them wrong and so on. Malapropisms. Anyway, sorry, Alexander. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I was just saying that anyone who's been through an art course or had to read any sort of art theory will recognise how terrible overwritten some.
Yeah, I actually, in one of my books, took Derrida to task and had a kind of little quip in there about, he's not going to be winning the English, they do this prize for English plain English writing prize. They do it every year. And they also give an award for like the worst, and it's usually won by like Judith Butler or Spivak or one of these sorts of characters who just write kind of postmodern drivel. And somebody wrote a whole article, just a journal article, basically taking my little quip as a premise and then using it as a defense of, basically saying like the obscurity and the opaqueness of Derrida is actually like part of what makes him special type thing. So it's kind of interesting to see this, what the people who are against plain speech or plain writing.
I think of that as a sign of just the complete degradation of standards. I mean, as our sort of quote intellectual class becomes stupider and stupider, they're more, they rly on crutches like that, like being inscrutable. I mean, I remember being just so when I was at university, it was the early mid 90s, and all that stuff is still the rage, and I just find it infuriating, absolutely infuriating.
Yeah, we'll get to Bacon in a second, but in my academic career, it was kind of my superpower to be able to take the complete gibberish these people would, like the kind of horrible, overwrought, French translated postmodern stuff and just basically translate it into something that anybody could understand. That was kind of, certainly in the first part of my career, what I did a lot of time doing, and it was actually remarkable, like speaking to, professors and so on, and realizing they actually don't really know what they're saying, because they really don't, because the language they're just repeating phrases that they've heard.
Yeah.
But when you drill down into it and try to get to first principles or whatever, they're just not there. And I mean, I hate to say this. This is one of the consequences of too many women being in academia, because they're just kind of like spiritually Chinese or something. They just kind of copy paste stuff that they've heard and don't really understand, and they just kind of reproduce it endlessly. So anyway, let us get to Bacon then.
Well, and related to the subject at hand, of course, the absolute worst of that sort of writing can be found in certain art criticism and art theory in the 80s, 70s, 80s, and 90s and beyond. Just absolutely, all of these people who are, again, who sort of swimming in Frankfurt School, sort of post-structuralist stuff, and then try to apply it to visual arts. It's just some of the worst writing ever penned by man.
Yeah. Just before we get going, Alexander Adams, anything you'd like to plug, sir?
Yes. If people would like to read more of my writing, see my art, or support me in any way, they can go to the Linktree link, which is in the show notes. Also had a couple of new people become paid subscribers to my Substack at alexanderadamsart.substack.com, and they get exclusive content, and it really does help me out because, as you may remember, I got married recently, so expenses have been higher than usual. So any income at all will be much welcomed by me and by Amy.
All right. So I know, Dyer, any spaces coming up or anything else you'd like to mention?
Yeah, probably. I don't know. Maybe tonight, maybe Friday for the spaces. Always a bit of fun. With a circle of slightly dubious people. So look out for that. Otherwise, there's always my popular account on what's it called now? X. You can look at my X's. I noticed that you don't even like quote tweet and retweet anymore. It's now post and repost. So,
oh yeah. That's true.
So yeah, people can look for that or watch obviously Unpopular Opinions. I thought yesterday was rather good.
Yeah, he's had pretty good reviews. The old Mr. Streets. I liked him quite a lot. He was it's really rare to find intelligent Zoomer, and for me to call a Zoomer intelligent, I mean,
and so, handsome as well.
Well, that's for you to say. All right, so we got up to. I think did we discuss this one?
Yes.
So it's actually the next one.
Yeah, a bit. Yeah.
So okay, just to get people up to speed, I think we had reached the start of the 1960s. Is that right? So.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is. So which one is this one? This is 61, isn't it?
1961. It's called Paralytic Child Walking on All Fours. And it's another picture painted after a Muybridge photograph, which we'll see in a moment.
Yeah. So this one belongs to the art museum in The Hague in Holland, and it had. I found this was quite a striking image when I saw it in the Royal Academy show from last year. Which I think anyone who saw it won't forget because it was an amazing show, and it's very disconcerting. It does feel oddly as though you are actually in the presence of a disabled person, someone who's walking. So this is actually how this child walks because of a disability, and they can't walk upright, so they're forced to walk like an animal. And so obviously Bacon, with his fascination about the overlap between the animal and the human, found this a particular interest.
And oddly enough, this is I would say this is one of the few of Bacon's paintings that specifically sort of uses a model, a model whose let's just say transformed physiognomy was not done at the hand of Bacon himself, but rather, done, an affliction. It's one of the few sort of paintings that specifically references, sort of disabled or, most of Bacon's, the transformation tends to be with Bacon rather than something inherent to the model. So I think this one is fairly unusual. I mean, although of course, as we know, it is a subject that interests him. I mean, with the medical texts and such, and of course, it interested Muybridge as well. There's, as we said, there's lots of those sequences done of enormously fat people with various sort of disabilities, people with various different body shapes and degrees of athleticism or whatnot. So again, I think you can sort of see the meshing of the interest between someone like Muybridge and someone like Bacon.
Yeah, so actually portrayal of people with disabilities is relatively rare. He does do the occasional one, but so the transformation is usually in the painting approach, and this was often discussed when he was alive. There was this talk of people feeling as though they were in the presence of a crime, or where an injury or an insult had been inflicted upon the sitter, because people have very visceral responses to this art, and that's quite understandable. And I do myself, and people ask, do you like this stuff? And I feel it's not that I like it. It's that I feel compelled by it. I feel fascinated by it. And sometimes that's an appalling fascination. It's, it's like when you see a crime scene photograph or something, it's like sort of you're shocked by it, and it makes you think about, well, what's natural and what's human, and what are the parameters for life. And so you're often looking at the Bacon paintings and you're thinking that's an extraordinary thing, but I don't know what I feel about it, and it does make me feel uncomfortable. And if I was actually in the presence of something like that, I would be afraid. And quite so I think that having a very strong reaction to it goes beyond a question of liking. I think liking is something that's quite banal.
Yeah, and I think I've talked about this on many different occasions. The idea of you liking something, it's not really germane. I mean, again, if you want to have a kind of conversation or engagement with art, whether you like it or not, it's just like saying, well, I like, tomato ketchup on my chips. Well, okay, that's fine. I mean, that's a matter of taste, but that's not really kind of a discussion. It's not really kind of an engagement with something. I think that great art, it enters into a space that is about more than whether you just like it or not. And of course, it's very difficult to say with many of Bacon's pictures that they're likable. I mean, they're alien presences, and they're often quite. I mean, despite what he said often, because he often denied that there was anything sort of disconcerting or unpleasant about them. And of course he played various sorts of verbal and intellectual games about them, but I do think that there's a malevolence to a lot of them that sort of challenges the idea whether you like them or not. I think that it really requires a kind of deeper sort of understanding or discussion or sort of engagement with them, because they're not likable. I mean, there's something really likable about this picture, but it is certainly compelling. Yeah. If you want to go to the next slide.
Sorry, yes, and they are shocking, I think.
Yeah, yes, exactly. You go to the next slide, we can see the source of this painting. So this is a child with infantile paralysis walking on hands. I think what's so sort of moving and also really jarring about this is, of course, the happiness evidenced on the child's face in this, which is, of course, something that Bacon only hints at. I think there's there's something really sort of touching and chilling about that.
Yeah, and it is so moving, because when you meet people with severe disabilities and they've lived with them all of their lives, and they don't necessarily sort of rise above them and sort of live as if they didn't exist, but they find ways of coping, and it's something that makes you profoundly grateful for your own, the sort of the coherence and the health that you have in your own physical being when you encounter these people. And this necessarily wasn't Bacon's point, because Bacon is quite a sort of he's quite Nietzschean and quite Darwinian in a way. So he's not got that sort of sentimental take, but that's certainly what I get out of certainly these photographs, and to a lesser degree the painting. Right, so this is the first of the great triptychs. So I'm not sure that we touched. So we had the 1944-45 triptych, the orange one, and this is the 62 triptych. This was painted just in time for the Tate retrospective, which is in 62, and that was when he became, from being a significant contemporary British artist, to being a European-wide artist, an artist of European status and significance. And so Bacon talked about actually painting this during a period when he was very badly hungover and he was in a bad mood, and he was sort of wrestling with how to get this done. And this is the first big triptych. So this is something of a gamble for him again. Remember, he's a gambler. This is something of a gamble for him, because he doesn't know how this is going to turn out. This is a lot more formal and organized than his 44 triptych. Even though, of course, you see he's largely abandoned that horrible green color and the sort of the dark blues, and now he's gone for something much more jarring, much more striking, which is the sort of sulphurous orange and the sort of the not quite blood red, but sort of medium red.
Yeah, yes, and these are colors that we see sort of in Bacon's work over and over again, especially as we progress through his career. As far as I mean, so the version of the story I recall is that he actually said this was one of the few pictures he painted whilst he was actually drunk.
Yes, I think yes, that's right. Yes, he did say that. Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, he said that he was on a 12-day bender. Basically, he was just drunk for almost a fortnight, during which he painted this picture. And I think he said something like, that it for this one moment it allowed him to be freer, which is again very odd, considering of course his general feeling, his general sort of expressed feelings about painting whilst being intoxicated. So
yeah.
But of course, then the question. I mean, the picture. By the way, I don't remember if he said, but yes, it's called 3 Studies for a Crucifixion, and of course, this is a subject with which Bacon returned again and again. Recall that his first in the Baconian myth making, he considered his first picture to be that again orange triptych, which is called 3 Studies for Figures of Basic Crucifixion. So the subject, or at least the kind of premise, interested him. But I think here we're presented with, again, because of the nature of the triptych, that you're given 3 panels, you're challenged to think about this as a story. But of course, Bacon, quite a number of times throughout his career, stated that he doesn't have any stories. He doesn't tell stories, that his art is never telling a story. So we're left in a kind of curious space with it, because obviously there's some sort of sequence of events. There's a scenario, there's a stage setting, there's vignettes of some sort of happenings, Again, I think this separates. This is one of the things which separates this sort of kind of more of a prosaic idea of narrative arts, like a comic strip or something like this, from sort of the best examples of sort of truly transcendent art, because it becomes about something more than the story. Again, it's also, of course, it's a visual thing. You're confronted by the sensation of these 3 pictures. And so, I think there's a tension between your mind's need to find a narrative and just dealing with what's before you, as a picture, as color, as texture, as design.
Yeah, and we should point out that the triptych actually comes from, it means literally picture in 3 parts, and it comes from religious painting from the Middle Ages, where you'd have generally what you'd have is something like a Madonna and Child or a crucifixion in the center, and then on the side panels, because this would be closed normally, and not this picture, but the triptych traditionally would be closed, and it would only be opened on high days and holy days. And so you'd have the central subject, which would be the maternity or the crucifixion, and then you'd open it up, and then they'd have these 2 sort of narrower panels, because of course these would generally be half the size of the central panel, because they would fold over, and these would often be the lives of the saints, or you'd have sort of portraits of donors. So the donors who had paid for the painting would be in the side panels, kneeling and praying and so forth. But here Bacon has divested of most of its religious imagery. So obviously it's called a crucifixion, and when you look at the sort of the animal being, the carcass on the right, that reminds you of course of a crucifixion. Bacon cited the Cimabue crucifixion that was in Italy, which has got an extraordinary serpentine kind of Christ. Here, of course, it's been inverted. It's on the right instead of being in the center where it would normally be. So Bacon has an ambivalent relationship with religion. He often takes up religious themes and the idea of religious suffering, but he has no belief in God, and he has no interest in the idea of redemption through salvation.
And this picture, of course, doesn't. I mean, again, it's not like you know, a traditional religious subject. You know, I mean, it's called Studies for Crucifixion, but there isn't the idea of transcendence. There isn't the central figure of Christ and his suffering and his, you know, his transfiguration to meditate upon. You know, what we're given, of course, in the central panel of this is just this carcass, this sort of obliterated carcass of human suffering. And of course, even that, I mean, even the sort of, you know, great pieces of meat hung up, howling, you know, you can see in the third panel the kind of vestiges of that kind of upward pointed howling mouth that we saw in the heads from the late 1940s. So even then, we're given this you know, the connotations of some sort of martyrdom, of some sort of transformation of living flesh into, you know, into a carnal sort of remainder. And and again, in the first panel, we're given these two figures in a room who are in some sort of relationship. Are they, you know, what are they doing? Are they cohorts? Are they enemies? You know, are they spectators? Are they donors? As Mr. Adams, you know, mentioned with the idea of painting the donor in earlier sort of traditions of religious painting. And so I think that you're getting this enormously loaded weapon that's pointed right at you when you sort of confront a picture like this. And of course, the full effect, you know, is because this is when these three are put together, it's very large, you know, it's confronting you on a very real physical scale. It's something that doesn't translate very well to watching on on YouTube. But you know, again, remember that there's always that component, the actual physical relationship between the viewer and the picture. So yeah, I think this is quite an extraordinary watershed.
It's an astonishing thing, and it was seen as like a bookend, and it sort of very consciously bookended the exhibition. So you had the first, because remember he considered the triptych of 1944, the orange one, as the beginning of his mature career, and this was almost the last painting that was included in the 1962 show. And this was seen as sort of like as a summation. It was also seen as him sort of returning to his roots and breaking free of all the sort of the businessmen in blue rooms and so forth that we thought were slightly dull. And I should actually mention, I hadn't thought about this, but when I talked about him becoming a European figure, get a load of where this exhibition was touring. So it opened at the Tate Gallery in London in May '62. It went to the Kunsthalle in Mannheim in July, then arrived in Turin in September. It went to the Kunsthaus in Zurich in the autumn, and then it was opened at the beginning of '63 in the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam. So this was a European-wide tour. This is like the Rolling Stones touring Europe. It's incredible.
Yeah, and it was really the sort of beginning of Bacon's, you know, his sort of meteoric fame in the world of art and beyond. I mean, again, remember that Bacon is another of these figures who got sort of wider public crossover, you know, because people were very compelled by these pictures.
And there were lots of critics. There were lots of people writing in newspapers, lots of art critics, including John Berger, who were absolutely hostile and opposed to this. They thought it was decadent formalism as far as Berger was concerned, because he was a big proponent of the kitchen sink school. He was a Marxist, and he wanted to see realism. He wanted to see the lives of working class people painted in dour tones and, you know, earth hues. And then there were other people who were sort of saying, you know, this is degraded, this is disgusting. And in a way, they're not wrong. This is degrading and disgusting. Yeah. And there were a lot of people who were saying, you know, this is the nadir of art, and how can you call this art? But this is also the point where Bacon gets picked up as a standard bearer for figurative art, because this is also the point when the Americans burst onto the scene. The abstract expressionists come over to Europe and they start exhibiting in sort of 58, 56, 58, when they start exhibiting on a large scale in Europe. And I know that this will come up in chat, so I'll mention it now. The CIA was actually backing a lot of these exhibitions of American abstraction, the abstract expressionists. So that's Jackson Pollock, Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, and so forth. So these were abstract artists. They were considered the height of freedom because, you know, America would allow this sort of thing. You couldn't get this sort of thing in the Soviet Union. So this was presented as a great flag for capitalist democracy because it would allow you this free expression. But this also became something of an orthodoxy. And by the 1960s, Europeans were either following the Americans with this line of abstraction, or they were rebelling against it. And they were thinking, well, you know, this has kind of taken over everything we've got. And soon enough, you have the rise of Andy Warhol and the pop artists and so forth. But Bacon was like a third way, as it were. He was considered a route back to the old masters. He wasn't a trad artist, but he could, you know, he'd refer to Velázquez and Cimabue and so forth. And he wasn't pop and he wasn't abstraction. So he was seen as sort of a viable figure.
Yeah. I mean, but even though, of course, we see, you know, in this I mean, for instance, this picture, I mean, we see him dealing with these sort of large blocks of color, these large sweeping gestures, the kind of, you know, tension between deliberately applied paint and paint that is allowed to drip or run. You know, we see some of these gestures that we see in abstract expressionism. I think people also should be very careful when sort of trying to mix up these things. There's this sort of tendency for people to say, oh, it's all modern art, you know, it's all abstract art. Well, no, abstract expressionism was something very specific. It was very specific to a time and a place and to a group of artists. You know, you can't compare Jackson Pollock to Picasso, but I know that again, popularly, people will try to do that. But yes, I mean, as Mr. Adams said, abstract expressionism was really so much tied to a sort of a group of American artists, and also, you know, it was just it was also this idea of that America is cinemascope. You know, I mean, the abstract expressionists, they did these enormous pictures, giant things, you know, with huge, you know, painting with mops and big brushes and throwing the paint around, you know. So there was this idea of, you know, these were also kind of analogs of the space, you know, America as this vast space. And I don't think it ever really resonated very much in Europe, you know. And also, of course, there, you know, as Alexander said, there was very quickly, of course, movements that rose to counter it, you know, with the proto-pop artists like Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns, and then of course Warhol and Lichtenstein and all the pops. So you know, but yeah, it's quite curious. It was a moment, but it's interesting to see sort of artists kind of worming their way in between these sort of spaces that were promoted, one way or the other. So,
can I ask a quick question?
Yeah.
Alexander Adams mentioned the Soviet art, and he also mentioned the left-wing social realism that some people were into in Britain. I mean, just in a kind of nutshell, what was Soviet art up to at this time? Because Stalin was famous for kind of, well, let's just say having a rather top-down view of what art should be, and actually making it a lot more, how can I say,
politically useful.
Yeah, he made various changes, but of course Stalin died, and there was the big de-Stalinization program under Khrushchev and so on. And I'm just wondering, do the Soviets react because you were talking about how the Europeans reacted to what was going on in America and the CIA backing it. Did the Soviets react to that, and did the Soviet reaction have any impact in Europe? Like, were the European artists in any way responding to what was going on there? Because, I mean, in the political culture of Europe at that time, there were a ton of, like in academia, there were tons of professors who were just fully paid up Marxists who actually loved the Soviet Union. People forget this now. Like, even in the Labour Party in the 80s, there were just people who were like sympathetic to Russia, essentially. So yeah, I'm just wondering if that has any bearing in the art space.
Well, so socialist realism, which we should distinguish from social realism. So social realism existed from essentially the last decades of the 19th century, and that was just showing things as they are, painting them realistically. Naturalism usually being interested in social causes or potentially social reform. Socialist realism was actually somewhat less realist because it was more idealistic. It was utopian. It was heroic. There were different forms of it. I won't go into it here, but that became.
I actually like it, by the way. I'm into socialist realism because it's got this. It does have a kind of heroic dynamism to it that I kind of like. But
well,
yeah,
it also becomes quite kind of let's just say celebratory of the masculine ideal. At a certain point, I mean, a lot of things at certain points coming out of the Soviet Union had a distinctively, men bathing, men, doing gymnastics. So there was a lot of that, which of course was very different from if you look at the very early things like Kazimir Malevich or Rodchenko or some of this sort of very early, kind of forward-oriented art coming out of the early days. That all ended, but I don't know that much about it.
Well, so socialist realism, as defined by Gorky, Maxim Gorky, and promulgated by Zhdanov, I think it was, became instituted as the official style of the Soviet Union in 36, 37 or so. And this was imposed on the Eastern Bloc from 1945 onwards. But remember that Stalin died in 53, and there was an interregnum, and then there was the Khrushchev thaw. Mm-hmm. So actually, at the time when this exhibition took place in 62, the Soviet Union was loosening its ties. So you had to be basically part of the artists' union to exhibit at all in the Soviet Union, but you could do stuff privately. So if you wanted to be experimental, you could do stuff in your own time, but you couldn't really show it, you couldn't sell it, you couldn't get it published. But there was a slight freeing of that, and there was a slight openness in the 1960s towards other types of painting. So there was more expressionism. You could do a little bit of impressionism. So you could do your workers on the farm, but you could do it in a sort of a slightly impressionist way.
Total subversion. That's why the Soviet Union fell. I'm joking. But yeah, did it have I guess the real question I had was, did any of that stuff, or what was going on there, have any dialectical relationship with what was going on in the West? Or were the West basically like, yeah, that just stuff is just crap, it's just inferior, we don't want anything to do with it?
We didn't even see a lot of it,
But that was it. It was restricted. It was considered, as you can imagine, it was considered decadent and depraved and generally corrupting. And most Soviet artists couldn't get to see it. There were times when you would have cultural delegations and you could leave the East, and especially if you were German. Sometimes there were occasions when you could go over to the Biennale in Kassel or whatever.
I guess the real question was the direction the other way around, the impact of Soviet art on Western or European artists. Did they basically just ignore what was happening in Russia, or were they in some way in dialogue with it?
They were somewhat in dialogue, but they were also slightly embarrassed because they followed the social realism tradition, and when they saw the socialist realism tradition, they were a little bit aghast at it because it looked awfully like the art that the mid-century Germans had been producing.
Yeah.
So they were like, well, actually, we don't really want to get involved in that.
It's
We're
a
going
bit
to do
too,
our own stuff.
heroic and
Yes, a bit too heroic.
Yeah, you get sort of narrative, so you get like the Museum of Modern Art, which was sort of formed in the 1930s,
I think.
In New York, but it told a very specific story, that began with Cézanne, and of course also included, very importantly, as an artist I mentioned, Kazimir Malevich. So this idea of kind of Russian constructivism was very much a part of the kind of heroic story of modern art. And when, of course, that all changed, I mean, Malevich ended his life doing sort of proto-Renaissance portraits of people in sort of antique garb. And, so that was seen as a sort of retrograde trail of modernism. So I think a lot of sort of in the West, especially in America, a lot of the sort of intelligentsia and art world people saw the trend in Russian art to Stalin and beyond to be just embarrassing, and it wasn't acknowledged. I mean, it was barely seen or heard of until much later.
It wasn't taken seriously. It wasn't really. I mean, there was the 58 exhibition or 56 exhibition in Brussels, which was a big international exhibition which had some Soviet stuff, but largely you didn't get to see it. It didn't get exported. There wasn't a great deal of appetite for it, and the Boomer truth regime as far as art was concerned was that anything that was not explicitly vanguard and modernist was retrograde, was associated with the mid-century Germans. And they couldn't separate out socialist realism, because socialist realism is essentially what was practiced by the National Socialists in Germany. So if you're a Western modern liberal, post-war enlightened person, you were pro-modernism and anti-realism.
Interesting, very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, should we move on from this one?
Yes. This is 1962. I slipped this in because absolutely sinister figure. I don't know a lot about this, and I wonder if it has some relationship to the character that we're going to talk about next. I don't know. Is this one of the early George Dyer pictures?
No, I think what this probably is the one of the last Peter Lacy pictures. So you remember Peter Lacy was the chap that Bacon took up with in the late 40s, who was an RAF pilot. He's erroneously described as a Spitfire pilot, as a fighter race. He wasn't. He did fly bombers during the war, and he did sort of see active service, and he obviously was an extremely brave person. It's interesting that they talk about his temperament being very, very volatile, and that he was quite violent, and that there's talk of this as perhaps being related to PTSD. Obviously not PTSD as it was called then, because it wasn't sort of diagnosed as such, but there was this sense that he was very much on edge, and he was an extremely volatile and violent person. He was also relatively well off because he was a banker or a city trader. And so Bacon in the 1940s and early 50s wasn't well off. It was basically the 62 exhibition. It was this point where he started to earn serious money, and he was financially independent, and he could indulge himself in sort of gambling and buying himself expensive stuff. Although he wasn't particularly materialistic. He did like to eat very well. He drank very well. He had expensive jewelry, although actually mainly it was watches, I believe. So this is one of the last paintings of Peter Lacy. Legend has it, I'm not sure that I've actually seen this I've not seen the evidence in person, but it is said that the day his Tate exhibition opened in the summer of 62, he received a telegram from Tangiers saying that Peter Lacy had died. And this was kind of not unexpected, because Lacy was a serious alcoholic and had been drinking very heavily for a long time. But still, it was quite a shocking thing for Bacon to hear about at the moment of his greatest triumph.
Now, you also, again, speaking of material subjects, I believe Bacon's contract with Marlborough, which began in 1958, somewhere around there. I mean, it specified
yes,
prices.
October 58.
Yeah, it specified prices for Bacon's work, generally based upon the size of the work. And so a small picture, 14 by 20 or 20 by 24 inches, was something like £165. So it sort of puts it in perspective. I think people have this sort of idea, that influenced by the kind of meteoric prices of Bacon's work in the past 20, 30 years, or like the kind of prices of artwork at auction or kind of blue chip art in present day. It was not the case at all. I mean, even though, of course, Bacon was beginning to be able to sort of survive on his own, and it really wasn't until much later in his career that he was earning large sums of money. And even then, I mean, never in his lifetime did he earn. I mean, his paintings sort of giving him the enormous sums of money that we see, these paintings go for now. So I think some perspective is in order, because I think it's something that this is rarely talked about.
I think his paintings only exceeded £1 million in around sort of 1990 or so, but he wasn't getting that directly. So this was in auction. Stuff was selling for slightly less than that, and obviously the gallery was taking a cut, so he wasn't getting that amount of money. But he became seriously rich in the 70s, I think.
Yeah, and people also should remember that art galleries tend to take a very large cut. We're talking about 50% in some cases, so of the sale price. So just to put that in perspective. The other thing I want to say about Peter Lacy is, of course, Lacy was a much more dominating figure. I mean, Francis Bacon, despite his sort of his ability with a brittle bon mot and the ability to be extraordinarily sort of catty, but he wasn't a domineering figure, certainly not at this time. And Lacy, by all accounts, beat Francis Bacon fairly frequently. He also destroyed some of his art, in fits of rage. So, when I mentioned this sort of relationship of Francis Bacon to kind of masochism, there was certainly a large element of that in his very tumultuous relationship with Lacy. Although I think all of Bacon's relationships until John Edwards were in the 70s were quite fraught.
Yeah. So I mean, it's been recounted that Peter Lacy used to get drunk and go into rages, and he would destroy pictures, and Bacon would sometimes be quite amused or delighted because he loved the excitement, he liked the chaos. And in one case, actually, I think Peter Lacy threw him out of a window on sort of the first floor or something. That's the British first floor, not an American first floor.
But I think, of course, the nature of Bacon's relationship changed. Of course, Peter Lacy died. And if you go to the next slide, a very important character appeared in Bacon's life in 1962, the same year as the last two pictures that we looked at. And this is a fellow called George Dyer. So Dyer, I don't know, there are different stories. There's a sort of mythological story about how Bacon met Dyer, which I'll mention in a moment. But George Dyer was he was a young man. I think he was about 30 when he met Bacon. He was from the East End of London. I mean, a pure, London Cockney of the old style. His family were there was lots of sort of criminality, in his family and his upbringing, and of course in his own life, because of course at various times he was a petty thief of one sort or the other, and he spent time incarcerated. He was also a drinker. Now, of course, that became much more of a facet of his life the more, after he met Bacon, and as their relationship progressed or regressed, as the case may be. But the mythological version of their meeting, which I've heard from several sources, I don't know if Bacon ever told this story, but someone did, which is that George Dyer broke into Bacon's flat at some point, and Bacon was there and sort of surprised him and basically said, "Take off your clothes and get into my bed." And that was the beginning of course, a very significant relationship. Now, of course, this is not true, or at least I'm pretty sure it's not true, and that they probably actually met at a pub. Do you know anything about this?
I don't know quite how they met, but they met in the early 60s, and you got to remember that this was the time of the Krays. The Krays were very big at this time, and
London gangsters.
The London gangsters, yes. Ronnie and Reggie Kray, and they were media celebrities at the time. Eventually to be imprisoned in I think it was the late 60s or early 70s. So there was a bit of gangster chic about George Dyer. I remember that someone said that Bacon thought he'd got himself a Kray, but as it were, but Dyer turned out to be not quite as much of a thug as he'd hoped. He turned out to be quite a gentle soul and a not very good criminal, and a little bit weak. I mean, physically he was quite imposing. I mean, he was relatively muscular and he had a very striking profile, but he wasn't quite as tough as Bacon had hoped, and he became increasingly an impediment and a drag on Bacon, as we'll find out.
And I do think this is also a sort of turning point where Bacon goes from having relationships with a series of kind of older men who had a kind of dominating position relative to Bacon, to sort of younger men who Bacon, I think, financially and psychologically and intellectually dominated. So it was it's sort of flipped from bottom to top, one might say. But yes, again, the sort of image that George Dyer put across was very different from his own personality, which was quite fragile. And he was of course about to descend into a viper's pit of the Colony Room and Bacon's Soho friends and the art world, none of which he knew anything about or cared about. In fact, I think he regarded Bacon's artwork as horrible, as awful and
yeah. He didn't like it. He didn't understand it. He was shocked at the prices that were paid for it. And the only reason we're talking about him so much is he becomes like an important figure in Bacon's art. So we're not really doing a stream on Bacon's life, but only where it intersects with his art.
Ooh.
Can you guys hear me? Sorry.
Hello.
Yeah. Curious. I kind of think that it's often good. I mean, people may have different views on this, but I think it's good that your partner just knows nothing about your work or anything. Just has no interest.
Yep. I absolutely agree. In fact, I will give advice to younger people. Often the worst thing you can do is to enter into a romantic relationship with someone in your own field. It's disaster. Yes. It's disaster. Yeah. Especially an artist. You don't.
Yes,
you're an artist.
I can attest to that myself. Yes, I'm not married to an artist, and that was a very wise move on my part.
Yes, and of course, I mean, the idea of a muse, it's something that, of course, has existed for since ancient times, and the idea of the artist and his muse, and of course, if you think of many artists, so a majority of artists, there's always been a kind, often a kind of figure that will either sort of organize their domestic affairs and sort of help them make their way through life while they do their work, or even directly inspire their work. I mean, the reason, again, I think there's so much emphasis on George Dyer is he was an amazing sort of muse for Bacon. I mean, I think Bacon also, to put it slightly bluntly, Bacon liked a bit of rough. You know, he liked these sort of young men who were slightly on the kind of seedy, rougher edge of life, you know, and none of whom were kind of in the art world at all. I mean, I don't think any, I mean, other than, of course, his sort of mentors, like much earlier in his life.
Did he ever take, because I can just imagine those are two such disparate worlds that collide. Did he ever take him anywhere to like do an exhibition or whatever?
Oh yeah, I know he took it. No, he took him everywhere. I mean, you know, of course, remember that Bacon was really a social creature, and he took Dyer everywhere, to all of the sort of parties, to all of the the cavalcades of drinking, you know, every night. No, he was intimately a part of it. Of course, in George Dyer's case, that was one of the things that sort of tore him apart eventually. You know, because
he would go to these events. Yeah, because he would go to these events and he'd be sitting in the corner, and there'd be people talking about like Camus and Sartre, and you know what the latest art review had said about Jackson Pollock and whatever, and Bacon would be making fun of that, and Dyer would be there not engaging at all because he didn't follow any of it at all, and he would just sort of sit there and drink.
Yeah.
And people used to treat him with contempt, I'm afraid.
How did that go over with his old gangster mates?
Except of course, for Francis Bacon, because of course Bacon, as far as I know, never really ridiculed. You know, he didn't ridicule these men. I mean, he didn't. It wasn't a sort of cruel sort of joke to him. You know, but of course that didn't apply to Bacon's brittle, catty friends. You know, so.
But did he have other mates outside? Like, it's just bizarre. I mean, did he have like mates from his other life? And did Bacon ever go in that world?
Well, yes, he did. I mean, he did. I mean, he would go to pubs. This was actually how he'd meet his next partner. But yeah, he would go to these pubs. I think he sort of this would actually lead him to get we won't jump ahead, but he did actually get himself a house in a place that in the East End of London, specifically so he could be around these people. And George Dyer did have lots of contacts. He was still a criminal. He was still doing criminal activities when Bacon was working, because when Bacon was working, he didn't have a model with him. So Bacon required a lot of privacy and a lot of solitude to do his work, and that was mainly during the morning until the early afternoon. And so during those times, Dyer would be off doing his thing, or you know, if Bacon went abroad, usually he went abroad. He generally, like, sometimes he went to America. He went to New York a couple of times for exhibitions. He didn't really like New York, but he went over there. But obviously, he wouldn't take Dyer with him, so Dyer was doing his own thing at these times.
It's just a bit weird because you don't really think of that world of like East End gangsters and criminals and so on in terms of, well, certainly I don't, intersecting, I hate to use such a leftist word, with homosexuality.
Oh,
it's just
but they were. It was absolutely.
I'm sure there were. I'm just saying you don't think of it that way.
Yes.
The craze, of course, for instance, you know. But I mean, of course, this was also the early 1960s was a time when there was this beginning of this sort of crossover between all these worlds. I mean, anyone who was alive in the kind of later 90s and early 2000s, there was this sort of revival of this image of the kind of Cockney gangster, you know, type. You know, people think of Jason Statham and Guy Ritchie and all of that kind of world. I mean, they were kind of looking back to this period when there was suddenly this weird intermingling between, of course, you know, Soho types and
actors, and there were judges, and there were aristocracy. There were various, you know, the Pitt Rivers scandal, and it was, you know, it was quite common that you'd have, especially of course because it was all illegal. So until homosexual acts were decriminalized in 1967, you were, if you were a practicing homosexual man, you were de facto a criminal. So you were naturally associating in some ways, usually not directly and usually not voluntarily, but you were associating with the criminal underworld or something. And homosexuality was a major route for blackmailing. So this was actually a source of income for a lot of criminals.
I guess what I'm getting at is the kind of the popular perception of what a homosexual is these days, I suppose. You tend, I mean, now I would say that if somebody thinks of gay, they immediately think kind of like effete or kind of camp in some way, or you understand what I'm saying.
I understand what you're saying. I mean, and there was that sort of theatrical sort of Kenneth Williams side, which it certainly did exist in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. But there was also the sort of masculine military public school stuff. It was
trad homosexual.
Yeah, I mean, because also, Peter Lacy, if you look at him, he looks like he's like a fighter pilot, and this guy's like a kind of criminal. These are very kind of masculine archetypes.
Absolutely.
This is kind of different side of it, I suppose. Yeah.
I mean, the whole idea is, of course, a sexual interest and fascination with masculine characteristics. So I don't understand why everyone would assume that. It's just a bunch of matron, camp
fairies. Yeah. Okay.
You want to go to the? Whilst we're talking about this, I've just got a couple more pictures of Dyer. Also, can you go full screen again?
Am I not full screen?
No.
Oh, like that? You mean like that?
Yes.
Okay.
There we go.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, here's
So this is the mid 60s, I think, and we have to remember that although Bacon was born in 1909, he fitted in very well and he looked extremely young. So in the 1960s, although he was actually in his 50s, in his late 50s, he was actually quite youthful, and he was very much seen as part of swinging 60s, swinging London, even though, of course, his formative years were pre-war.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of where like this theme that we've been talking about, this intersection, is actually captured anywhere in kind of pop culture, and the closest I'm coming to is something like Noel Coward in Italian Job. Something like that. That's probably the closest I can of where it's actually depicted somewhere that people might recognise. Because I'm guessing the film. I mean, usually think swinging 60s. All like the Michael Caine characters are straight, aren't they? They're not gay. So I'm just trying to think of like where you get that.
Well, you're not going to see that so much until later on, again, because of course it was officially criminal until 1967. You're just not going to see it depicted, at least not in an open way in sort of mass media. Even though, of course, it was always there. I mean, again, this sort of high and low, this sort of again, you often find these kind of homosexual worlds are sort of associated with men at the sort of more extreme edge of masculine behavior. I mean, of course, because again, if you're attracted to the masculine ideal, you're going to go for, again, men who embody the spirit of adventure. You're going to go for the kind of criminal. You're going to go for the sailor. You're going to go for the soldier. You're going to go for the builder. Because again, because of course we see increasingly in the modern world the sort of the removal, the deliberate sort of removal of these expressions of the masculine spirit. So I do think that's part of where the crossover is. And of course, also you've got to remember that Bacon was also a serious gambler, which is another sort of area of his life which would have intersected with the kind of more sort of shady elements of society.
Yes, because the gangsters were going to the same casinos that he was going to. And there was a lot of illegal gambling as well, sort of.
Running
unregulated
their
gambling.
own. Yeah.
Very cool threads, has to be said.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, they both appreciated. They were both snappy dressers. Both appreciated good clothes.
Yeah, and also we should say that Bacon never, although he never broadcast it, he never hid his homosexuality. So people were aware of it, and so they couldn't blackmail him because, it was known to people, even though it wasn't sort of included in the Tate catalogue of '62 or directly in '85, but people sort of knew. People picked up the inferences.
Yeah. I mean, he talked about it openly during that episode of the South Bank show, for instance, which was
and it was mentioned in the interviews with David Sylvester in the 1960s and 70s, even though of course they appeared mainly in print form, so they were not sort of so broadcast. But yeah, so he would discuss it. Yeah.
We'll go to the next one, the last sort of picture of them together. So.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think Dyer was quite a sort of striking figure. Again, probably I think that Bacon came to realize he wasn't quite the rough gangster that he wanted to be.
Sorry, just the last question I have on this kind of thing. I mean, it's been certainly a theme in the relationships of Bacon that we've been talking about. Do you think it's fair to say that a lot of, because I'm reminded of various other ones I've studied in the past, like Joe Wharton is the one who springs to mind, is that there's a kind of there's a violence and power dynamic in some of these relationships, and I'm just wondering if that's a common thing, if in some way power is an indivisible part of homosexual relations.
Well, yes, but of course, I think power is an individual part of any human interaction. So I think of course, it's implicit in a relationship between a man and a woman, because of course that is the sort of steady state of humanity. That sort of dynamic is we expect the kind of power thing. But of course, when you put two men together, even if it's not a homosexual encounter, there is always in every male interaction, I think, the possibility of violence, the possibility of competition. Men are always competing, and of course, they find ways to do it in sort of peaceful, amicable ways. But there is always the underlying threat that eventually there will be a challenge. There could be a sort of clash for power. And that there could be violence. So I think that yes, it ends up being a larger part of kind of the dynamic of homosexual encounters. But of course, again, it's it's a very murky area. It's a very murky area because I as I said, I think these dynamics are always there, whether it's a sort of sexual encounter or physical encounter, business encounter, intellectual, whatever. It's always there.
Interesting.
Just made explicit.
Very kind of Foucauldian or Harold Pinter kind of. These are the people who are coming to mind, where the indivisible power dynamics of any relationship. The Servant, by the way, the film The Servant, maybe. Yeah. That was 60s, wasn't it? That's probably another one where
was it 66 or 67 or something like that? And Harold Pinter overlaps very much with this period as well.
Yeah.
No, he also came from. He did a lot of odd jobs and came from rough area and stuff like that.
Yeah, he came from Hackney.
Yeah. So, all right, let's carry on.
before the Diane Abbott's took over. All right, so this is called Three Studies for a Portrait of George Dyer. This is 1963, and of course, I don't know. You probably don't have a convenient list. I can't. I should have figured out how many works that Bacon did that explicitly involved Dyer. Because there's a lot of them, dozens of them. And some, of course, some people, I know that we will come upon Michael Larry later on. Michael Larus later on. Bacon did portraits of it. French intellectual and writer, considered the works, Bacon's works, featuring Dyer as his sort of best works, his most sort of pointed and probing works. So, but of course, yes, I mean, Dyer became an instant fascination. Of course, the relationship eroded over the years. But in the beginning, of course, there was a really intense sort of intermingling of Bacon's art and his personal life.
Talking of his personal life, do you know who the first owner of this painting was? This triptych?
No, but I can look.
No, I've looked it up for you. The answer is Roald Dahl.
Oh yeah, this is one of them. It's difficult. I was going to mention Roald Dahl because, of course, Dahl owned, I believe, 4 different works by Francis Bacon.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, including there's another portrait of George Dyer. No, a portrait of Lucian Freud that Dahl owned. But yes, I don't know if we mentioned this, but Dahl and Bacon were lifelong friends. And Bacon would visit Dahl in
is it Buckinghamshire? I think it is.
Yeah. Great Missenden, I think it's the village. Yeah.
Yeah, so we should tell people that these are this is the small format. So this is the 14 by 12 inch. So each one of these canvases is 14 by 12 inches. And so he commonly did these. So he sort of would alternate between the large single paintings, less often the triptychs, because he did do, I think, sort of about 30 or 40 triptychs, and then he'd do these small triptychs, which would be heads. And see, these were basically like these were similar to mug shots, or in the same way that you would go to a photo booth, you used to be able to get sort of sequential photographs. And so Bacon used to have these photographs from friends, and he would have some of himself, and these would be used in this sort of triptych format. And this was partly because, of course, he was interested in doing it, but I think it was also partly because his dealers told him that not everyone has enough space for a large painting. Can you do some small stuff? Which does impinge on artistic production sometimes, I'm afraid to say.
Yes. And of course, with these, you also have to remember that if you're being paid by the canvas, you by making each work 3 different canvases, of course, you've tripled your profits. So, I mean, this recalls I remember back in the Warhol streams when he did the sort of disasters, or the kind of double portraits of Liz Taylor and such. There was sort of a printed canvas with the images on, and then there was a blank canvas that just painted the kind of background color. And when asked why he had this sort of second blank canvas with the work, he said, well, it makes the work twice as big, so I can charge twice as much. So I don't think that was part of Bacon's calculus, but still.
One of the calculuses of Marlborough, so remember, he moves to this sort of super pushy, super successful international dealership called Marlborough. And one of their things was, of course, they wanted to maximize their profits, and they wanted to maximize the amount of stuff that they could exhibit, because they had multiple venues. They had sort of so I mentioned that they had a gallery in London, they had one in New York, they had one in Switzerland, they had one later on in Madrid. And in order to keep their high profile art, and Bacon wasn't especially prolific, he produced something like 700 paintings, between 700 and 800 paintings over his lifetime that survived. Quite more that he destroyed. But he wasn't especially prolific, and his pictures in the later years became quite expensive. So what the gallery suggested he do was that he do prints. But unfortunately for us, he didn't really do the artist's original print, so he didn't go into the workshop. Yeah, see, so he wouldn't go into the workshop and work on the plates himself. He wouldn't do drawings on plates, because he was sort of notoriously tetchy about not drawing. So he's quite sensitive. There would have been ways to make good original prints, but he didn't want to do them. He found it, I think he found the whole business a bit mechanical, so he didn't even try. So what instead he got them photo reproduced. He would be consulted on colours, and there'd be sort of slight changes and so forth. And then he'd just sign off an edition. But basically he hadn't done anything. They're essentially glorified posters, which I think is quite a shame from those of us who produce original prints at low price.
At a wonderful price, yes, of course.
Yes, on a wonderful variety of papers, all available now. Search my links.
Can I ask? Did Dyer ever give a reaction? Was he ever like, "Oh, horrible, doesn't look like me at all"?
Yes, often.
Yeah, no.
Often.
That quote, by the way, that I said where he said the paintings were horrible. That is a literal quote from him. So I mean, he hates them. Can we dip out and watch one of the short videos, which sort of deals with this question a bit about the nature of Bacon's sitters to the portraits he produced. The video is called "The Injury."
Got it.
You have.
Let me just get a. It's always a bit funky when you first put them up. All right, here we are.
Let us say that you have a model, somebody you have already painted many times from memory.
Yes.
Have you ever had such a person sitting for you?
Yes.
And what has happened?
They inhibit me. They inhibit me because one of the things is I would, if I like them, I don't want to practice the injury that I do to them in my work before them, if I like them. I would rather practice the injury in private, by which I think I can record the fact of them more clearly.
In what sense do you conceive it as an injury?
Well, because people nearly always believe that the distortions of them are an injury to them, no matter how much they feel for or how much they like you. They do nevertheless, as most of them are not people who are concerned with art, feel the distortions are forms of injury.
Don't you think their instinct is probably right?
Possibly.
I like it.
All right.
I think it's very interesting that he characterizes the act of portraiture. I mean, the act of the artist looking and recording as an injury.
Has that got the image back?
Yeah.
You guys? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Excellent. Shall we move on from this one?
Move on. Yep. This is another. There's another 3 studies for Portrait of George Dyer. This is 1964, I believe.
And what he'd do is he'd have the same color background for each portrait.
Now again, I mean, you want to there's a couple of sort of details of this one, but also this idea that I put forth, I think in the first stream, was that increasingly Bacon was trying to create, I can't remember his exact words, but trying to create an image whose manufacture or whose sort of logic was, you couldn't pull it apart. You couldn't really sit down and sort of say how these how these were made or how they were kind of composited. What the process was, what logic there is to the sort of distortions of the phase, and of course, in the end, what they really signify. I mean, it was this idea of again capturing the in between. Between one moment and the next, to capture this sort of essence, to sort of make a distillation. You think about making stock, in the kitchen, where you put all of your ingredients and you cook them over a long period of time to extract their character. And of course, then you can strain your stock and then boil it and reduce it and reduce it and reduce it until you have very little of very thick, very highly flavored, glace de viande or what have you. Something that is the sort of the abstraction and also the distillation, the concentration of the character, of the essence of food. And of course, the same thing, I think, happens in art. What is a portrait? It's not just someone's appearance, but there's also the expectation that the artist is drawing either something from that person, some aspect of their character or their personality or of their appearance that is more than just what they look like, that the artist is giving you something else. And so I think that was a kind of that's something that sort of hovers behind all of these pictures.
I think also this is a time to talk about the way his technique changed.
Yeah.
So you'll remember he started using panels. The orange triptych from 44 was painted on boards, and then he moved to working on the back of canvases. And you can see that there's an unpainted area where the ear is. And that's raw canvas that's showing through. That's unprimed, so there's no primer on that. The primer is on the other side of the paint of the canvas. It's on the back. So the front side has become the back, and now he's working on the back. And what he would do is he would sketch out very loosely in very dilute paints, basically where the main form would be. And sometimes he would introduce sort of like an outline of where the sort of the cage or the bar or the furniture would be. And then we know this because we've got paintings that he didn't finish, so we can see the different stages. And so he would start to outline the figure, and he put in a little bit of the figure. Then what he would often do is he would fill in the background. So he would use different kinds of paints. He would sometimes use emulsion paints. Oil paints are what would usually be used, but he would use emulsion or sometimes acrylic paints for areas that didn't require detail. He would also use sometimes pastels. He would rub the pastels into the raw canvas, and this would be perfect because it would get really sort of ingrained in the canvas, in the linen. And this was also another reason why his pictures were behind glass, because some of them included pastel, which is quite
dust, as we talked about. Literal dust
yes.
from the floor. Yeah.
And so he would apply paint with brushes that were actually so he didn't go to art school. So when you're taught at art school, you're taught certain, like if you want to do detailed, like you want to do a face, you're going to be using a smaller brush than usual. Or Bacon tried to use large brushes, and he would have large gestures, and he wouldn't apply things. He would apply things carefully, but he would apply them with vigor and elan. So he'd think about quite clearly what he wanted to do, and then he'd actually apply the brushstroke very quickly. And he would use thick brushes. He would sometimes use household brushes. He would then
rollers, famously, especially with the large pictures, he would use literal like foam rollers.
Yes, he would use foam rollers just to apply the background. The backgrounds, the surrounding areas. And then you can see, if you look at the eye on the right, you'll see it's sort of patterned, and this comes from corduroy paint, corduroy cloth. So he would dab his pieces of corduroy with paint, and he would just dab it on to the picture. And so you'd get these incredible sort of speckled textures, all these lines and so forth. And sometimes
you see that a lot on these portraits, and
sometimes he'd throw paint. So that white sort of glob where his mouth is, that's him sort of flicking a dab from the tip of a paint. So he's got a sort of a sort of clot of paint, and he's thrown it, but very particular. He knows where he's aiming for, because he had a lot of practice with this.
But also, it's a game of it's a game of chance, because of course it could go wrong, and of course because of the way these are painted, you couldn't really fix them. Like if something went wrong, it was almost that was the end. you could. It's not like if he had again been painting on the proper side of the canvas. I'm going to do a little live. I don't know if this is going to work at all because I don't know if you'll be able to hear it. But I've got a small linen canvas which is primed on on the proper side, and so I've got a brush. So you hear that?
Very faintly.
Very faintly. But if I flip it over and I rub the brush on the unprimed side.
Yes. Yeah, it's a lot rougher.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of grips the paint and it pulls the brush has a lot of resistance on it. And so again, that gives Bacon the opportunity to make these wonderful textures, but if you make a mistake, you can't rub it out. You can't use solvent. You can't. No. It's just not going to come out. So a lot of times you could make one wrong move and you fail. So I think that element of chance is something that appealed to him.
Yeah, and he was well known. People would go over and they would see him slashing paintings with a razor blade. I think he deliberately waited until he had an audience. Sometimes
yeah.
I think it wasn't just coincidence. No,
it's quite a dramatic gesture,
Yeah, and sometimes, and we do have some of those paintings. He actually kept a couple where he actually cut out parts, but he kept the rest of the painting. Sometimes he would keep the bits of the portrait in a larger painting, and he would save that. Other times he would cut it out and he would leave the background. Quite why he was doing this, I don't know, but he also would give people, sort of various handyman paintings to destroy, and he would sort of ask them to take them away and destroy them. Shall we tell the story about the Chelsea colourman, or shall we leave that to the very end?
Up to you.
Okay, we'll leave it to the end. We'll leave it to the end.
All right. You want to go on? There's one more detail of this one. There you go. And again, you can see that that texture that I'm talking about, where the paint is really sort of pulled off the brush quite abrasively by the texture of the back of the canvas. So,
yeah.
All right.
So this is a lot more. Yeah, and that was a lot more risky technique than he was using earlier on. So he did actually gamble a bit more with these in a way that he didn't so much with the early ones. Although he did damage some of the early ones. He would paint them until they went too far and he couldn't rescue them.
These are a couple of sort of images of Dyer in Bacon's studio. These are very interesting to me because, of course, this character of vulnerability that we mentioned, that this sort of once the sort of preferred veneer of the London gangster was stripped off. I mean, literally stripped off in this case of clothes as well. This idea of this sort of vulnerable fellow in Bacon's personal hell, which was his nightmarish studio. I think there's something quite sort of haunting about these and quite touching. These two pictures and the next one as well. But something we'll see more explicitly later on, of course, is Bacon's studio, which has a character of its own.
And the mirror, and remember the mirror in the background.
Oh, yes,
something that dates from 1930. That's the only thing of Bacon's from that really early period that he kept.
Yeah,
I think
that
just
round
because it was useful
mirror you see in the previous one. Yeah,
I have to compliment the bravery of this chap for putting his bare feet on that floor.
Yes.
Hard enough to even walk in there, Yeah.
Yeah. Apparently, Bacon wanted him to be nude, but he said, "No, I'm not taking my pants off.
I'm not taking you, not taking me pants off."
So this is George Dyer on a bicycle.
Yep.
It begins to sound like a bit like a Dr. Seuss thing. So it's George Dyer cycling, George Dyer walking, George Dyer sitting down,
crouching, George Dyer looking in a mirror.
Yeah. So this is a painting that's now in Basel, and this is one of a whole series of paintings that he did in the late 1960s. of George Dyer in different situations. So be standing in a room, sitting in a room, crouching. There was one of him on a toilet, which we'll get to later on. So this is, and there you see he's been sort of flinging the paint. This is an unusual one where he's covered the background entirely in a sort of textured. So this is I checked the description and it says there's sand in this paint, and in the background paint. And of course, you see the white splashes of where he's thrown the paint, and he's painted around them. So this tells you that the white splash was not entirely the last thing he did. It sort of came near the end, but he worked around it as well.
Yeah, literally, and the some of those splashes of paint, they're not just splashes; they're giant globs of it that sit very high above the surface of the picture. So.
I was just going to say that for some reason this particular one reminds me of like those failed Olympic mascots that they have every single time there's an Olympics, there's like a failed mascot, and I'm sure one of them looks a bit like this, like from the mid 80s or the 90s or whatever. But you'll have to go back and have a look at the history of Olympic mascots. But
okay, I know what you mean. You mean like, I remember the 2012 Olympics. That
was a awful one as well.
I think they were meant to be like melted blobs of steel or something.
Okay.
This is the portrait of George Dyer crouching. Yeah. But of course, I think that when you sort of look at the progression of pictures that he did during Dyer's lifetime, there again, when you apply the sort of Baconian vision to someone, especially a character like him, who was again out of his element in a way, and almost being taken apart relentlessly, brutally taken apart, every sort of bit examined and rearranged by Francis Bacon. There's something, again, I think the character of Bacon very, very much changed with after his time with George Dyer. There's something quite brutal about it, and
sadistic, and even.
You get and you get this. You take another example of like Pablo Picasso, and of course his endless cavalcade of mistresses and wives, and lovers and paramours and muses, and then of course that was also a component. Just again, a relentless. And of course the positive aspect of this is that here's George Dyer, someone who would have disappeared. Probably had it not been for Bacon, immortalized forever in art. The same with Picasso and his relationship. But there's also something quite destructive about that as well. I think it is.
And also deliberately. I think we should over psychologize, but I'm sure that there is a degree of resentment and frustration that's being played out by Picasso and Bacon when they paint their lovers in ways that leave them so sort of animalistic and deconstructed and sort of break down their ego. It's I don't want to go too deep into it, but I think it's a facet of the art.
Yeah. Of course, again, I have I'm not a Nietzschean in any other aspect of my life, but again, I certainly appreciate this dynamic because it's played out in my own work in life.
Yeah, and I would say it's really interesting that he does this to Dyer, but he doesn't do this to Freud. So of course we haven't mentioned Lucy and Freud in this particular stream. Go back to the other streams which are not earlier streams; they're completely standalone streams. But we mentioned Lucy and Freud as a good friend of Bacon. They were good friends from the 1940s through till sort of end of the 60s, early 70s, when they started to sort of so early 70s they started to part ways. But Bacon does lots of paintings of Freud, but they're less inventive, they're less creative, they're less cruel than these ones, which is why these are my kind of slightly more interesting, because they've got more variety and they've got more excitement, and he's doing more ambitious things. But it's noticeable that he had quite a degree of respect for Freud in the early years when Freud was like a sort of a super realist, as it were. Then later on, they became a bit more distant. But so I don't think that Bacon could have done this to sort of to Graham Sutherland or Lucian Freud or Frank Auerbach or Kitté, who he all of whom he knew. He could only do this to someone who was not an artist and not someone he had full or complete respect for.
And of course, notably, he didn't really do it to a lot of his friends either. I mean, he didn't do this to Peter Beard. He didn't even really do this to John Edwards, who we'll talk about later on. It's
yes, that's a good point.
Subsequent paramour. The character of his relationship to other people was very different, And of course, again, Bacon was remembered by many of the people that he associated with as quite a sort of a generous and loyal friend. But of course, if you read some of the materials about the progression of his relationship with George Dyer, it's not the impression you get. So,
this was particularly fraught relationship, which we'll get to a bit later.
Yeah.
Okay, shall we carry on?
Yeah. This is a portrait of George Dyer in a mirror, 1968. And again, the kind of self in the mirror, of course, the very interesting character of this picture, where the sort of quote unquote real George Dyer has sort of almost lost himself. His face is almost sort of swallowing itself up, and he exists only in the mirror. But of course, is it a mirror or is it Francis Bacon painting of George Dyer's face? Which is a very good question and a very interesting, of course, equivocation. This idea of because Bacon often did this, and later on he does this as well, which is to sort of feature some of his own work in his paintings. He sort of makes reproductions of things in a few works in the 70s and 80s. So, but again, the man in the mirror
is
very interesting subject.
It's also a Michael Jackson song as well. But
I knew as soon as I said it.
I'm thinking of the man in the mirror. This profound, insightful 80s classic pop song. I just wanted to ask a question about the. Is it just me, or is Dyer always having a cigarette in the is that a cigarette at the end of his stump hand?
Yeah.
And I think I've been spotting some sort of smoking or cigarette all the way through. Is that an ashtray, for example?
Yes.
Yeah. So
although I don't know if I put too much significance with Dyer, because there's ashtrays in many Francis Bacon paintings, and cigarettes. In fact, we'll get to them.
But maybe that's the essence of it. Maybe he was always smoking a fag or something.
Well, he probably was.
Yeah, I think he was. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of photographs of the two of them together, or Dyer on his own with a cigarette.
Of course, Bacon also smoked at this time as well. So again, despite his asthma, which of course I can relate to because I smoke and I've got asthma. So,
but I mean, you can just imagine the kind of East End boozer or whatever, the pubs that they were hanging out in and so on, and they would have had I don't know. It's just noticeable that there's always a little cigarette there.
Oh, it's wonderful. I mean, I remember a time when you could properly drink and have a fag at an establishment with your friends. And look at what they took from you.
I don't want to go off topic too much, but that song "Man in the Mirror." When I was a student, I had a friend. I was actually pretty good friends with him. I was his best man at his wedding and stuff like that, and he was at mine twice. he had a routine. He's kind of poncy fellow, and he, you know, like you know, in American Psycho, where he kind of has all the layers of facial creams, and he's getting ready and all of that sort of stuff. And he had before we'd go out, he would put on Man in the Mirror at like full volume and sing it in the mirror to himself while he was getting ready, like with a towel around him. And this became something that he did like as a weekly thing. For 3 years I got this guy I was living with getting ready to Man in the Mirror. So
this guy definitely wasn't you? I'm just checking.
No, it wasn't me. It was a buddy of mine who fancies himself as a bit of a Top Gun type character. So, you know, that was his other favorite one, playing with the boys. But anyway, let's carry on.
This is one of the people you went on an adventure in Magaluf with.
Oh no! He wouldn't be caught dead in Magaluf, I'm afraid. This is more of a guy who he'd like, what he'd do? He was much more of the type of be like, oh shit, I've lost my mobile phone, I'll have to buy a new one, and he'd do it like 3 times in a month or whatever. He was he's a very different type of character, let's just say. But I hope he's doing well. He's living. Well, I won't location dox him, but
yeah.
Okay, all right. So what is this? Yeah, who is this woman?
This is Henrietta Moraes at the Colony Room, or maybe the French pub in Soho. This was a character who Bacon met in the 1960s, I think. And she became Dee. I think you probably know more about her.
Well, she was again one of these characters who sort of appears in Bacon's work, and of course he met. I mean, yes, she would have been probably part of the Dean Street sort of circuit that they went on. You know, the French pub and the Colony Room, Gargoyle. You know, various places that in Soho that Bacon and his muse went to, but. And she was sort of, again, a kind of one of those bohemian characters, of which they don't really exist anymore, was certainly sort of associated with Soho in the past. She was sort of an artist model, and she had numerous affairs. I mean, she posed for Lacy and Freud, and I believe others. She had various love affairs. She had several marriages, including to a writer called Dom Moraes, who gave her surname. But she became, of course, Bacon's female muse in the mid 1960s. Now, this is all very interesting because, and there was a sort of again a very sort of business oriented reason, because I remember, I don't know if it was a sort of a statement that Bacon made himself at some point or someone else made, but you know, realizing that there was a whole market for people whose interest was not the cataloging of male flesh, you know, and so Bacon thought, well, maybe I better paint some women as well, and of course, you know, this presents a very different type of subject. You know, I mean, he says himself during that conversation with what's his name on the South Bank show, that of course, you know, for an artist like Ang painting the Turkish bath, or you know, for all the artists who are famous for the celebration of the female body and female flesh, Rubens and such. It's particularly charged, again, because of their kind of appreciation and desire. But of course, he didn't have that. You know, it was not where his interest lies. So the question, of course, is then what can you find? What does the sort of evocation of a female figure, female body, do for someone like Bacon? What does it draw out of him that isn't related to his own personal kind of erotic physical interests? And so I think it's very interesting, and he painted many pictures of her and other female muses, but most notably her, because of course he painted many sort of nude portraits of her, which were all based on photographs by John Deacon. I think he. Let me see. I had a
Not
note
the one
there.
from Queen. Sorry,
No,
Not the one from Queen, no.
not the one from, not the one from Queen. No, Deacon, Deakin. I think he painted her 16 times at least. So, there you go.
Yes, so he was doing portraits and he was doing figure studies. Interesting that the figure studies are mainly inverted, so you have the body facing downwards and the legs facing upwards, which I think was
notably, which of course I think relates to some of the things we saw with the kind of crucifixion, the idea of the sort of figure crawling down the cross. If you go on, you can see another one of these Deacon.
That's the wrong direction. Yeah.
And this is again a piece of studio ephemera from Bacon's studio that was certainly used to as a reference for various paintings he made of her. It was earlier than I thought. He met her in 1960 or 61, and his first picture, which is this first picture of her as the kind of inspirational model, is this one. Now, of course, I say model, but in Bacon's case, of course, it's model removed once or twice removed by photographs. So he never, as far as I know, he almost never painted anyone from life. Never had a model in the studio.
Oh, he didn't have any nude models. He had a couple of portrait sitters, but he, as he said, he felt inhibited by that, so he would mainly work from photographs. And I think the first photographs of Henrietta were from just imagination and I don't think memory, because I don't think he'd seen her nude. But then later on, he commissioned a set of photographs from Deacon because he thought of her as a good subject for nudes. So that was the way around it went.
Okay, carry on.
Yeah, so this is directly inspired by the photographs that Deacon took. And this I think these actually work very well, which is interesting because, of course, he wasn't looking with a sexual eye, as it were, because he was that wasn't his taste. But I think these paintings work very well.
Yeah, it's very interesting, of course, because we've seen what he often does with figures on beds. It's often like a charnel house. It's often the sort of aftermath of a massacre. It's figures in beds in distress. But even though, of course, it's quite a distorted figure, it's still kind of painted from the art historical aspect of a kind of a voluptuous female nude, on a bed in a position almost a kind of come hither position.
I mean, to my eyes, this is the only sexual painting he's done. That's probably because I'm not gay. but also, like, how can I say, like the other ones we've looked at, I think were more distorted than this. Whereas this is like,
you've got the swell of the hip, and you've got the sort of beautiful, delicate, tapered sort of curve of the calf, and then you've got the shoulder and the breast matching each other, and so it works very well. It has quite a degree of elegance, surprisingly.
Is it accurate or fair to say that this is more commercial work from Bacon? This, like, given what you said about his reasons for doing these in the first place, I'm just wondering.
Well, it might appeal to more buyers, but I'm not sure that necessarily means it's more commercial.
Right.
And certainly this wasn't the sort of stuff that was used on posters. This wasn't
is not
used
like
on the outside of catalogs.
This is not like Bacon doing Let's Dance or something,
No, this was not his Let's Dance period. No.
Okay. All right.
Okay, you want to go next? 3 studies for portrait of Henrietta Morris from 1963. So, and again, we can see some of these things we talked about. Bacon's technique, his portrait technique, that we saw with the triple portraits of Dyer.
Yeah.
Sort of played out here, but very different in character. I think these pictures.
And also you notice that he's using quite a lot of color, different color. So 60, so around sort of 58, 59, he drops the blacks and the very dark blues. He goes to greens. Thankfully, he drops that in sort of 61 or something. And from then on, there's quite a variety of colors. And I think people have talked about this as being in terms of like swinging Londoners and so forth. And I think that you do, in the 60s, you do get the appearance of very vivid colors. You get the pastel colors, you get the sort of the pinks and the taupes and the sort of, lilacs and so forth. And all of this comes out in the paintings. And I think that this it gives the paintings a lot more energy and variety and attractiveness, even though some of the colors are a little bit overwhelming. But it's an amazing thing to go to an exhibition of these paintings. And then you're standing in front of something which does feel quite remarkable, but it also feels very precisely from that period, from the late 1960s or early 70s. And these color schemes really, if you've ever been in any of those rooms, these will stand out for you as being quite of their time.
I love it. And it's again, I think that we talked about in the previous stream about that extraordinary, that exhibition of paintings inspired by Vincent van Gogh, because I do think that was really
that broken aspect,
for his color and his sort of inventiveness. It's amazing how sort of sophisticated his use of color became, so quickly after that. This painting also, I mean, again, to give you an idea about prices at the time, it probably would have been originally sold for, less than £1,000. This particular painting was sold in 2012 for £21.3 million. And it's quite small. Again, remember these are 14 by 12, I think.
14 by 12 or 14 by 10, yes. 14 by 12. Yeah.
Okay. And this is later. This is 1969. The last one was 1963. But again, three studies of Henrietta Moraes, and again with a very very sort of extreme, but sort of circumspect use of these extraordinary sort of colors at the edges.
I had a look, by the way. The £1,000 in 1963, if you adjust it for inflation, is about 17k today. So still quite a long way away from 23 million.
Yeah. And the triptychs go for over 100 million now.
Yes, we'll get fairly soon to the record for Francis Bacon at auction. And there's just a detail of this is the final picture I put here of Henrietta Moraes. It's called Study of Henrietta Moraes Laughing, not from 1969. It's like Return of the Mouth and the Teeth.
Yeah, and this is supposed to be semi-related to a still of a film called Hiroshima Mon Amour. I think there was a still of that from that film that was found in Bacon's studio, and this sort of is a melding of Henrietta Moraes and the subject of the film, because Bacon would sometimes amalgamate sort of various faces. So he would recognize in a photograph of someone famous, he'd recognize that as having a characteristic that related to someone that he knew, and so he would find a way of combining in a hybrid form.
Absolutely monstrous.
Yes. Okay. So these are shots by John Deacon of Lucy and Freud in his Hampstead home, I think. No, maybe not Hampstead. West London, anyway. Hammersmith.
So yes, Lucian Freud, of course, people may be aware, another very famous British artist, and we talked about his eventually fraught relationship with Bacon in previous streams. Lucian Freud, I would say that probably the most famous picture that he did was the benefits supervisor sleeping, which is also known informally as Big Sue.
Yes.
An enormous nude woman on a patterned sofa. Quite a good picture, by the way. But yeah, so Freud and Bacon were certainly close for a while, and acted as each other's models. Freud more for Bacon more than Bacon for Freud, but they both painted each other. Freud did quite a number of pictures of Lucian Freud over a period of a few years.
The advantage for Bacon was that, of course, he could use photographs, so he didn't actually need Freud to be there, whereas Freud always worked from the model. He almost never worked from photographs. So he only did, I think it was 2 or 3 paintings of Bacon, including a very famous portrait, which was unfortunately stolen in Berlin.
Yeah, we'll see it in the next slide. You want to go to the next? This is another piece of Bacon studio material, but it features a black and white reproduction of I don't remember the year of this picture. It's the 1950s, early 50s, and it's a portrait of Bacon done by Freud. In Freud, Freud's style changed a lot over the years, and his sort of early pictures and early portraits are very much in this sort of manner. But his work changed over the years. But yes, this picture was famously stolen in 1988, and it's never been recovered. So,
and it was unfortunately easy to steal because this was very small. It's basically you could as long as you could get it off the wall, you could get it under your coat and get out without people noticing, because it is such a small painting, which unfortunately made it easy to steal.
Yeah, Freud did that. I mean, if you remember, not that many years ago, Freud painted a portrait of the late Queen, which was very small, like I don't even know, 4 by 6 inches or something. There are photographs of him of Queen posing for Freud, which is quite extraordinary in itself. But yeah, so again, you get the idea of why it's easy to kind of lift a picture like this. But so yes, this picture of this painting of Bacon has never been recovered. And then what follows is just a couple of paintings Freud by Bacon. These are the 3 studies for a portrait of Lucian Freud from 1964. And just a couple of tales, you can get a sense about the kind of texture of the paint and the brushwork.
I do wonder about the backgrounds. I think because they're very red, and at this time, Mark Rothko's work was being exhibited a lot. Now, Bacon always made a big point of saying that he had learned nothing from the abstract expressionists. It was just mere decoration. It was of no interest to him at all. But I think it's significant that these very strong colours, they come in not only at the time when you have the change in tastes in decoration, but also you have the presence of abstract art and large colour-filled paintings which get exhibited in the late 50s and early 60s. And I think that if Bacon definitely thought that he could use, because he used things from everywhere. He used things from newspapers, from journalistic photography, from other paintings, from things that he saw in the street. So he definitely took things from paintings that he maybe disliked, but he could steal with the best of them.
Absolutely. I mean, and of course, very explicitly, we watched a video, again, a clip from the South Bank show, of him slagging off Mark Rothko. He said, "The dreariest paintings have ever been made. I hate that dirty maroon color." He was quite savage about Mark Rothko. I think he was correct in some circumstances about that. But certainly, you can pick up a good idea from even from things that you just dislike.
Can I ask? I mean, he seems to be settling into a bit of a style here during this period. You know, these there's been a theme with these triptychs, and it's kind of getting to be like a Bacon House style, if you want. Is he more famous for these, or is he more famous for the earlier ones with the guys in the cubes that we were looking at last time, or are they equally kind of famous?
That's a good question. My feeling is, and I'm sure Dee might have maybe a different perspective. I think in the popular imagination, it's the popes and the men in blue rooms that are the most well known for the public. But I think for people who are deeply involved in the art world, they will perhaps be looking at these and thinking, oh, these are more Bacon. Or maybe it's the 1970s triptychs that we haven't reached yet. But what do you think, Dee?
I think that's probably true. Certainly, I think that in the popular imagination, it is that there's a few of those portraits of the Pope, the figure with meat, those are going to be the kind of enduring images in a general sense. I tend to think, of course,
and the three Fury things. The first, I forgot what it's called now.
Oh, the fragments at the base of a crucifixion. Yeah, figures at the base of a crucifixion, or fragments.
Yeah, but that of course becomes especially famous because A, it's the work that kind of launched them, but B, it's in a public collection in the Tate, and it's been reproduced all over the place. So that's why people know it so well.
Yeah, and people should don't discount it is also the placement of paintings, because of course before the internet, I mean, you could either see them occasionally reproduced in magazines, periodicals, that sort of thing, or you could buy art books. But the only other option, of course, was to go and see them. And so often, most of these you wouldn't see them because they disappeared immediately in private collections.
Yeah, especially the smaller works like this. These would go into a private collection and they just wouldn't be seen. These wouldn't even appear at large exhibitions. So what would happen is that you would tend to get the same key works. You'd get a sort of a history of modern art or whatever, and there'd only be like 2 or 3 reproductions of a Bacon, and one of those had to be the first one. So it got reproduced so much that it was, and then you'd have like a screaming Pope. And of course, if you're expecting to see those, if you're publishing a book, as I know this is a writer of books, and I publish books on Dali and Magritte and stuff, there are certain pictures that you have to select. The publisher will tell you, even if you don't put them in, the publisher will tell you, we need one of this one, we need one of this one, we need, we want The Persistence of Memory by Salvador Dali, which is the melting clocks. You've got to have that in. And as it happened, I chose that one anyway, but if I hadn't included it, the publishers would have included it without my say-so, because basically it has to be there, and you can't do a book on Bacon without including the first orange triptych. And so that's the way it works. If you've got certain key works, they have to be reproduced basically in every publication.
That's like his explosive debut album. Then like there's a successful follow-up with the popes and the men in the squares and so on. Difficult third, was there Oasis Be Here Now or whatever? It was difficult third one with the Van Dyke weird colours and that period. And this is like a return to form, Best in Scary Monsters is these these ones we're looking at.
These are scary monsters.
It's it's like doing a Rolling Stones compilation without satisfaction. You've got to have it in there, People are going to return it. They're going to say they want their money back if you don't include it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So it will be the pictures that people see the most that will sort of influence how they think about the art. I mean, if you remember painting 1946, which is the one with the sort of umbrella and the dictator and the meat shop, it's like pink and black. And then of course that's in the Museum of Modern Art and famously almost always on display. So that
always helps. If it's in a big museum, if it's in a key museum, then it's almost always on show. It's very rare that. The only time when the Bacon triptych, the first triptych, is not on show is when it's on loan somewhere, which is relatively rare. But yeah,
relatively rare.
I mean, if I was to, again, these are all imperfect analogies, of course, but the thing that the parallel I from what you guys are saying, the thing that I think of most is like Bob Dylan in the popular imagination is all about like 60s protest stuff and like his 60s albums. But people who are really into Dylan like his Blood on the Tracks and that kind of middle. And this feels like maybe the kind of some weird parallel to that 70s middle period for Dylan.
Yeah, but also you've got to remember that the connoisseurs are also the snobs. And they deliberately distance themselves from the greatest hits. Then they can't say the greatest hits because that would just leave them with the normies. So they have to choose something that's slightly more recherche.
Yeah, interesting. But also this is more mature work as well.
Yeah.
Like
it's more sophisticated.
Yeah, etc.
Much more sophisticated as Lacy work. I mean, as I said, far fewer duds from this point to the end.
I'm also suggesting that in that analogy, by the way, the Van Dyke period, if you can call it that, is like self-portrait. Okay, let's carry on.
Oh, you mean Bob Dylan's
self-portrait? Bob Dylan's self-portrait, that weird, that kind of period where Dylan went off the boil for a couple of years there.
Yeah.
Okay.
By the way, it's funny you mentioned the Rolling Stones because Bacon actually did paint triptych portrait of Mick Jagger in the 80s.
Yes, that was one of the very few that he did of celebrities.
Yeah. And I checked, of course, as I always do. There is a line in the Andy Warhol diaries mentioning that he was meant to meet Mick Jagger for something, and he went to his hotel room, and Mick Jagger was sleeping in the middle of the afternoon, and Warhol writes that it's because he had been out drinking with Francis Bacon the night before. So,
and, it's funny that Jagger's come up because that's another popular culture artifact, if you want, which captures the weird intersection we were talking about earlier on between the two kind of different sides of 60s or whatever is performance, of course, because that is all about like London gangsters, and it's got Mick Jagger in it. Doing like hedonistic and wild sex and all that sort of stuff. So.
But then you've also got to think that Paul McCartney was getting involved with William Burroughs in the 1960s, in the late 60s. So there was, and Yoko Ono was a performance artist before she was John Lennon's lover. There's a cross section between high art and pop culture and pop music, rock music.
Yeah. Very, very odd, of course. But Burroughs being one of those figures. I mean, again, he was friends with Francis Bacon. He was friends with Andy Warhol. He appeared with Laurie Anderson in the 80s. He was.
And Paul McCartney ended up buying René Magritte's easel.
He did. I didn't know that.
Yeah. I think so, yeah, he did, and he was given, and Linda McCartney bought him Magritte's last pair of spectacles. That's a fascinating detail included in my best-selling book, René Magritte, published by Prestel, 2022.
Did they not think of buying like a painting? They just
yes. Well, that's the whole Apple logo, the whole business about Apple being Apple Core. Right. A joke there. Well, it came from Paul McCartney admiring René Magritte's paintings of apples, and actually there was an idea in '67, I think it was, the year before he died, for René Magritte to paint Ringo Starr, which never happened. That would have been something.
That's very odd. It's very odd when those things, those sort of crossovers occur. You don't think of it's like that example you always give Evel of writing about the Beatles. It's just not worlds that shouldn't
we mentioned Dylan. You guys mentioned Burroughs just now. I seem to recall that there's a famous meeting between Burroughs and Dylan as well, where he meets him. He goes and sees he meets Dylan when he's young in New York or whatever. Just tells him he writes some good ditties and he'll make a lot of money or something like that, so really kind of quite dismissive.
Profound stuff.
Yeah.
Watch out for the heroin, Bob.
You do wonder, because obviously Bacon was filmed with Burroughs, and you think they're both trying to think of sort of profound and witty things to say on camera, And it's like, how are you going to do that? I mean, what are you going to talk about that's going to be worth recording? I mean, in the end, these things turn out to be just sort of largely small talk, or people going back to their fallback positions and their sort of well-worn phrases. It's very disappointing.
I also have to mention this. I mean, I've mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again because if you haven't watched it, you really should. One of my favorite kind of really old movies is Haxan, the kind of witchcraft through the ages. And Dee did a brief impression of Burroughs there.
Yeah.
There's an excellent version
Thanks
of that.
for picking up on that.
Oh, no, I liked it.
There's an excellent version of that film with Burroughs as the narrator. And that is the version I love because it's awesome. It's so good. So you have to watch the version, not one with subtitles, but one with Burroughs. It's amazing.
But Burroughs met, if we ever do a stream on Burroughs, I mean, we'll get quite a lot of mileage out of it, but Burroughs is another one of my fascinations or obsessions. Burroughs actually met and collaborated with Kurt Cobain, which is a peculiar thing.
Yeah, it's very weird, some of these things. So certainly Burroughs. I mean, of course, Burroughs also did. He was the voice on with a band in the 80s called Material, which I think is most famously one of those tracks is used in a season opener of Sopranos. So there's a famous sort of montage of the various characters at the beginning of the season with this William Burroughs rap about the ancient Egyptian. The ancient Egyptian posited 7 souls, over the top. So it's quite odd how these things show up. I'm speaking of artists having sort of meeting and trying to find something fun to say. There's a film that you can watch on YouTube of Burroughs and Warhol in like 1980 having lunch at the Chelsea Hotel, and that conversation, of course, being Warhol is wearing a pair of headphones for no reason. They're not like plugged into anything. He's just wearing these headphones the entire time, and most of the highlight of that is them having a conversation about eating hair, the sort of like jugged hair, and then Burroughs signing his newest book for Warhol, and Warhol going, oh great, oh gee, great, oh. So.
It means so much.
Oh, thanks. It means so much. oh, it's so great. Okay, shall we move on? There we go. This is another picture that was owned by Roald Dahl, and this is another portrait of Lucian Freud from 60, later 60s, even though, of course, it's that weird green color again. I think this is a later 60s. Have to correct me.
Of course, somebody's purity spiraling, calling the Burroughs version of Haxan trash.
This is from 67.
67. Okay, thank you.
This, I believe, was that was included in. There's quite a poignant exhibition at the Marlborough Gallery in 92 or 93. I think it was the year after he died. No, so it'd be 93. And this included. There's a whole series of small portraits, and this was included. It's quite a touching show.
Yeah. So this is 3 studies of Lucian Freud from 1969. Again, sort of back to the box, so to speak. But because we can see how we talked about Bacon's, the way he portrays a figure like Lucian Freud compared to how he sort of treated, his lover, George Dyer. There's a very, very different sort of kind of set of connotation.
Why is the box back?
Well, the box never goes away. I mean, the box is always there in one way or the other. So, and of course, remember that every painting is a box.
Yeah, and also this becomes a very useful. So obviously, this is a triptych again, but it becomes a very useful way of organising the space in complicated setups. So you can sort of have it as a sort of like as a throne or as a room, or you can suggest mirrors, you can suggest picture frames, and so it's a good way of organising space. So without being necessarily descriptive.
Yeah, And of course, it also can, is often used by Bacon to, I mean, it's this sort of non-Euclidean Baconian space, where you've got the kind of frequently the curvature of the room, but of course contrasted with this this distorted, distorted perpendicular figure.
Yeah. So what you need to do is, if you've got a very organic form, you emphasize the curves and the organicness against something that is not organic. So you'd have like ruled lines or straight edges. So if you want to emphasize something that's colored, you have it against a sort of a contrasting color. If you want something you want to emphasize the sort of the softness of something, you get against it, you contrast it against a hard surface and so forth. So if you want to do a human form, what you need to do is you need to emphasize the humanity and the fluidness and the softness and the movement against something that looks rigid and inorganic.
Do you remember in Superman 2 when Zod and his minions get trapped in that glass and they're kind of floating about? In a strange way, you could say that are the people trapped and behind the glass in some way? Is that what is this? I mean, are those boxes meant to have? Are they meant to be like see-through glass? Like, what are we? Or is it just a stencil?
Yeah, I would say that yes, it's also like a prism. So it's something that you can see through. It's completely clear, but it's also distorting and reflecting. So it's also like a mirror. So it's partly glass, it's partly mirror, it's partly a prism, it's partly a cage. Yeah, so it's doing all those things, and it allows him to break up the form. So you see that he's got lines that go straight through the head, and that's no coincidence. That's deliberate. That's to allow him to break up the form, and you get the straight lines going straight through the figure. So he's not sitting in front of that line that goes vertically. That vertical line goes through him, and it's like those sort of perspective tricks where you have the little boxes, and it's like, oh, is the box going forward or is it going backwards, and so forth. And he's doing that here deliberately to confuse your senses.
Yes, but these would probably, in Bacon's case, have always, they wouldn't have been explicit things that he was trying to convey. These were whatever the kind of logic that you can construe afterwards was probably not the intent. It's difficult to say. And this reminds me again so much of that bit from T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. In our empty rooms, I have heard the key turn in the door once, and turn once only. We think of the key, each in his prison. Thinking of the key, each confirms a prison. And of course, these of course, Eliot being a poet, resonated quite deeply with Bacon. On a commercial note, this picture is the auction record for Francis Bacon. Was sold in 2014 for $142.4 million US. And it was sold to the ex-wife of Steve Wynn, who is a big casino mogul in Las Vegas. So
owner of many famous paintings, including some great Picassos.
And two of which, of course, were one of which he severely damaged by putting his elbow through it accidentally. Yeah. And another, which, of course, when he was selling, was at, I believe it was that showroom at Sotheby's, and it fell with a self-portrait of Picasso as a sailor. And that was also damaged. So yeah, keep Steve Wynn away from your Picasso.
Or put glass in front of your paintings.
Or put glass in front of your paintings, exactly. Although again, it was the ex-wife who bought this. These paintings.
You could put your painting inside a glass box, or would that be too meta? Be like buy this and then stick it in a glass box.
Well, the Bacons they're all behind glass, so.
And some of them are locked up in storage lockers in Zurich in the Art Freeport, which is a subject for maybe another stream. Art subject. And investment and security swindles. Yeah.
Yes. You certainly want to lock it up in don't want to be like the Saatchis and put it in London warehouses and then have it mysteriously burn. Remember when the Tracy Emin's
Yes.
tent and such were destroyed in that fire? Okay, we want to move on, and this is the sort of final of some of Bacon's famous friends and the muses. This is Isabel Rawsthorne. I don't know if you have anything particular to say about her.
Yeah, she was a celebrated model from the 1930s. This is her in the 60s or so. She lived in Paris, and she was the lover of Alberto Giacometti. So we talked in a previous stream about how Bacon admired Giacometti and was sort of acquainted with him, was friendly with him, not deep friends, but so Isabel Rawsthorne was painted and sculpted and drawn by Giacometti in the 1930s. She herself became an artist in the sort of 90s. She studied art. She was from Liverpool. She studied art, and she became she did most of her work starting in the 1940s and 50s, and not a terribly original artist. I reviewed a book on her, and which I think you probably will be able to find. If you just look up her name and my name, you might find the review online. But I wasn't terribly impressed by her work. I think it's worth having a look. I think it's worth it being documented and discussed. But I don't find her particularly original or compelling as an artist.
No, I think you're right. I again, there's being a concerted effort, in recent times to sort of shoehorn in these various figures, often female, and sort of elevate their importance. Perhaps, I don't know. Maybe it's just because I'm a famous woman disrespecter. So.
Well, I think I may have covered this in a previous book called Women and Art, available now from all booksellers.
You're relentless.
Oh, I have to be. D.
He's like Steve Turley. Seamlessly moves into shilling.
Right. Okay. And of course Bacon painted Rawsthorne many times as well. This is a small portrait. This is I think the one you can see most easily, the white paint thrown at the canvas. There's a tail of it in the next.
It looks like somebody spilt yogurt on it or something. And like it doesn't look like it's actually meant to be. You know what I mean? It's almost off. It's almost like not part of the painting.
It's different. Yes, it's a yes. This is what we call impasto. So it's like a paste. So it's more like sort of, it's got the consistency of something like thick mustard or something like that.
Yeah.
There are of course various discussions about the fact that the fluid was often white, and this was sort of described in seminal terms.
You took the words right out of my mouth. Maybe not the best method to use, but yes. Of course. What it is it when and of course Bacon described, when asked why he did this, he said that he was frustrated with the work, and so he would just fed up. So he would literally throw his this white paint right on her face. And of course it happens in other pictures, as we saw with George Dyer as well. So yes, and of course you could certainly have a discussion about the psychological implications of this. And also, given Bacon's interest in primates at the zoo, primates behind cage, of course, are also known for let's just say throwing their own substances at people's faces.
Have there been essays on Bacon and spunk?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah.
Oh, here it is.
There you go.
Close. Yeah.
And I mean, he would literally take a tube of white oil paint and squeeze it into his hand and fling it. In this case, anyway, that's what he did. Not great practice, by the way, because of course when the thicker you put oil paint on, the more apt it is eventually to crack. So
it tends to sort of sink. It becomes what looks quite luscious when it goes on wet. It dries in. It dries and sinks and it cracks and it starts to sort of become sort of sunken and it becomes like a shriveled skin. The way to prevent, there are various technical ways of preventing that, but if you're just going to put on paint neat, as it were, that often happens and it's unavoidable.
Painting thinly is usually recommended. I mean, because of course the oil paint it doesn't really dry. It's not drying the way that it's sort of a water-based paint dries. It actually polymerizes, and it will polymerize, of course, from the outside in, and often never will sufficiently polymerize from the inside of it. So there will be this sort of tension between the well-organized polymer chains on the surface and the ones inside, and hence crack. But so far so good for this one. It looks all right. It
would be very difficult to restore a painting by Bacon. I've not seen it. I've not seen it done. I've heard mention of something being repainted by him, but I think it would be extremely difficult to restore any of these.
Very difficult to conserve these. Yeah. And of course, I mean, as with a lot of artists from this period who were experimenting, Bacon again bragged about not receiving formal training and not learning technique. And of course, this could be an advantage in the sense that it sort of encourages experimentation, but of course, it also can lead to bad practice. You get an artist like the American abstract expressionist Willem de Kooning putting mayonnaise stirring mayonnaise into his oil paint, things like that,
and paraffin and all sorts of
sorts of things. And Mark Rothko, whose many of his works are basically destroyed. I mean, he famously did a series of murals for Harvard University, which completely changed color because he used a sort of commercial emulsion, or
he used some sort of dyes from commercial paints, and then he'd sort of add eggs to the mixture to make a sort of tempera thing, and and they fade in ways that you can't actually repair them.
No, there's no.
And if you repair them, you're repairing them with material that's more permanent than the stuff that you're repairing. So they're going to age differently, and so it's essentially it's a nightmare.
But of course, this is not a problem. Exclusive to contemporary artists. I mean, of course, the famous example is The Last Supper by Leonardo, which was a technical experiment using an oil-based paint on a wall in the manner of fresco, and that started to fall apart within his lifetime. And of course is a complete disaster now. So not just something for modern artists.
I'm not suggesting anybody does this, but a little while back, Alexander Adams said it shrinks and goes like shriveled skin. Somebody isolated that audio, all sorts of interesting things may develop from it. Okay, so let's carry on.
Rub some lotion on its skin, or else it gets the hose again. Okay, this is... Yeah, you want to talk about this one?
So this is Isabel Rawsthorne on a street. What's this? Sort of 67, isn't it? So this was based on this was taken from a photograph of her standing in Soho. I think it's one of those John Deacon photographs that you just saw. So it's one of those where she's just standing. So this is 67. This is the one that's in Berlin now, which I remember seeing when I lived in Berlin. So what you see here is Isabella Rawsthorne standing in a dress. She's been isolated from her setting, which was a Soho street. Bacon has introduced both a motor vehicle from the 1930s or so, because he had quite a lot of journalistic reportage photograph from that period in different books and so forth. Not necessarily from that period, but from later periods. And there is also a bull a running bull on the right, a motif that we will see later on.
Okay.
Oh,
Okay.
sorry, and also and you see this sort of like a tan patch which is above the bull. That has been, you can't see it very clearly here, but that has lines drawn across it that suggests that it's there's some sort of blinds, there's some sort of Venetian blinds. So you've got a weird thing of being inside and outside, being in a particular place, but also being in a place with very incongruously a bull. And of course, you notice that what she's standing on is essentially basically a sand arena. This doesn't actually have sand in the paint, but this is basically a reference to a bullfighting arena. So she has been translocated to a different environment.
Mm. Right.
I'm just wondering if there is a natural break point coming up, because we're approaching we're approaching time for this one, because and I'm reckoning, looking at the rest of the folder, that there's probably at least one more show in this series.
Yeah, if we can get to the end of the 1960s, which is just a couple of few images away, that would be a good break point. But
It'll set up for the end of his career then. Okay, all right.
I just put in a couple of sort of photographs of Bacon from the mid to later 60s, because also the thing that becomes notable in the 60s is Bacon turns also to himself as a model. So he there begins a sort of periodic series of self-portraits that continue for the rest of his most of the rest of his career. So it's sort of very interesting that he's as he was painting portraits, which he claimed to not like. He on at least one occasion said he didn't like painting portraits, but and of course that he also said that he hated his own face, and yet of course he also famously subjected himself to to the injury, as he said.
Who is this on the floor here? I recognise this figure.
That's Baudelaire. That's the Nadar portrait of Baudelaire.
Yes.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
And you can see again the chaos from which these pictures were born.
Yeah, so he used various materials, including oil paint, emulsion paint, pastels.
Aerosol.
He didn't. Yeah, he later on he used aerosol, and then he used something else that we'll talk about when it comes up. But yeah, so he was quite varied. But obviously, remember, he didn't draw. So apart from a few sort of scribbled lines on the end pages of books, the end papers of books, he didn't do drawings proper. So he was just painting.
Have you seen those drawings that were found in Italy at some point?
Yes, they I think they have been impounded and are being used in a fraud trial.
Oh, okay.
If you're talking about the Reverino collection.
Yeah, I mean they're the only proper drawings I've ever seen by Francis Bacon.
Oh no! Oh, okay. Well, no. In which case, it's not those.
Okay.
Yeah. There's. I think we mentioned the two sets of works that have been discounted by the estate. One of the Reverino drawings, I think it's how you say it, the Italian drawings. And then the other one is the Barry Jewell collection, which the Tate has returned to Barry Jewell.
Just two questions I have before we move on from this. The first is, did Bacon have any of the Quentin Crisps about him where he didn't clean, or was it just his studio that was messy?
Just his studio.
Just his studio. No, there's
he was
little
very
videos
fastidious about his personal, about his body, about his clothing, about his cooking.
I've got
generally.
pictures of his kitchen for the next stream, and also there's a video for the next stream where he explicitly talks about this. That that it isn't that he was a messy. It wasn't that he was a dirty person. It's just that in his studio, it was a different world.
The other point I want to make is that somebody in the chat said Jordan Peterson is throwing a fit at the state of that room, and
I mean, Jordan Peterson.
I did the Conservative Manifesto yesterday, and one of the enduring themes of that is that Peterson is raging against hedonism and nihilism, and of course he's famous for saying "clean your room," and I just think it's somewhat interesting that Bacon, who's known for hedonism and nihilism, has a messy room.
Yeah, but I would say that messy room is him setting up an environment which helped him to work. He wasn't a messy person and he wasn't a lazy person. So this is something that he did specifically because he liked the chaos. He liked kicking through the material and books opening and photos falling out. So he'd have photographs that he commissioned. There'd be pages that he'd torn out. There'd be newspaper pages. And he wanted that chaos. He wanted that compost heap of images that would inspire him to connect Baudelaire to a bullfight, as it were. So this was not him simply being lazy or slack or lacking motivation. This was quite a deliberate strategy that he only applied in one area of his life.
Interesting, because I remember David Bowie talking about the need of embracing chaos in that rather interesting movie that came out. That was an enduring theme in Bowie, saying that for artistry you need to embrace chaos.
Yeah,
so
and he also used the cut-up method from Burroughs
yes.
for writing lyrics.
And of course, I disturbingly learned yesterday that David Bowie didn't like Francis Bacon's work.
Oh, really?
There's an interview from 1998. Hang on, I can pull it up. Maybe I can't. Oh, there we go. Yeah, appeared in the New York Times in 1998. The interviewer was Michael Kimmelman, and it's a whole thing talking about art. And he asked him where it is. So Bowie famously collected Frank Auerbach and owned a couple of fairly important works by him. But and so they talk about Auerbach, and Kimmelman says, "What about Francis Bacon?" David Bowie says, "No. 2 or 3 pieces I find extraordinary. I like his figures around the base of the cross, the very first piece that blew him to fame, and of course the Pope, which was an extraordinary thing that he came upon, but he weakened fast. His demise was swift."
Mainstream fan. Casual mainstream fan Bowie.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, I mean, it's very telling. He says the Pope. Of course, the Pope. Well, yeah, no, come on, Bowie.
Also, Bowie added, "This chaos is killing me." Let's carry on.
Bye, love. Okay. He also didn't like Lucian Freud. I don't buy into him being the greatest painter that we have.
Yeah, Bowie probably didn't like fat women. That's why.
Well.
Let's carry on.
All right. And this is 1967 in Bacon in his studio. He referred to the walls in the studio as being his only abstract works, and also joked once that photographers always liked these walls because they always wanted to put him in front of them because they made an automatically interesting photograph. So.
And of course, Bacon was extremely adept at knowing what made him photographic and sort of photogenic, and he very carefully calculated his image, and he used these photographs of his studio in the same way that artists have always used photographs of their studio as a way of promoting and cementing his reputation.
Indeed, we'll look at a couple of self-portraits from this period, and then I think we'll stop.
Yet again, I've got a headache for like the 3rd day running. I'm wondering if there's something in the water. Or, do you know why I'm getting so many headaches?
It's not a tumor.
So this is a self-portrait, D?
Yeah, 19. This is earlier, so we've skipped back a bit. 1964.
No. This is Lucy and Freud.
Is it?
This is Lucy and Freud on the bed. Do you remember the photographs we saw earlier?
No.
Yes.
Well, I think the body is, but the painting is called Self-Portrait.
Is it really?
Study for a Self-Portrait, 1964. You're right that it's obviously based upon one of those photographs.
It's an amalgam, isn't it?
Yeah,
that's a weird one.
Yeah, but the head, of course, projecting out from the box, almost as if it's a painting on the wall. Curiously enough, yes.
This is actually reminding me of something I read in those. When I was reading about the Holocaust the other day, that in the Nuremberg trials there were. I shouldn't laugh. It's obviously terrible. But in the Nuremberg trials there were depictions or descriptions that the Nazis had these giant iron, like they were trying to devise like more efficient methods of killing, and they had these giant iron blocks that were just kind of they would tell them that they were going for a height measurement, and then the iron block would come down and kind of smash them on the head. And you see that block behind it because of the splatter effect. It looks like it's kind of smashing this guy in the back of the head. So that's what it brought to mind. Obviously, there's been no evidence of these machines found, but it is part of the official record. So yeah, carry on.
Yeah, I just make sure I check myself. Yes, it is.
It is called Study for Self-Portrait in the catalogue raisonné.
Yeah, it's written on the. It's titled on the back as well.
Yeah,
and it was sold at Christie's in 2012 for £21,545,250.
Yeah, so I think this is his face imposed on a more an almost Lucy and Freud body. So
I didn't notice that, but absolutely is that same pose. Very weird to make an amalgam of him and Freud together.
There's a guy in the chat saying, "I wonder what Jonathan Bowden thought of Francis Bacon." Turns out he does actually have a piece called "Thoughts on Francis Bacon," where he says, "This is Bowden. Francis Bacon's work is an attempt to find an image that will explain the 20th century to itself. His support for the right, on the other hand, is an attempt to further the artistic process. Basically, if the right, capital R right, guarantees inequality, as it does, then the distinctiveness of the artistic personality is preserved. The fragility of the artistic ego is safeguarded by the social inequality that the right safeguards. In short, the right guarantees the importance of an artist, his inherent superiority by virtue of the fact that it upholds order. As a consequence, the artist always prefers hierarchical inequality to humanitarian anarchy, as Celine once put it. Bacon's pictures, in turn, are an attempt to free meaning from reality and return it to reality. He does not wish to tell a story. Indeed, he is fundamentally narratological. Bacon wishes to mark the canvas and conduct an image on the basis of the avoidance of that mark." And then it goes on and on. It's kind of a. There's another 2 paragraphs there, but you can have a look. Bowden does not have views on art, as some people may imagine. He was quite into art in general, wasn't he? So
yes, he was. That's quite interesting, and of course that accords with a lot of things that we've discussed and that we will discuss. That puts me in mind that if we after we finish talking about this picture, we should end with a video that where a short video where he talks directly about the subject of inequality.
Yeah. Okay.
Sorry. Do we have other things to say about this?
No.
Okay.
And, except that the black square from the splatter, you can see that what he'd done is he the painting was flat at some period, because those are not marks that you would be able to get from. They would drip in a different way if they were. If the canvas was vertical when the marks were made, so that just shows you, and also those sort of dots that's drips from a paint, from a loaded paintbrush, which is held over a flat painting. So it's interesting that he was manipulating the canvas in that way.
Indeed, and I also that sort of spray or that splatter you can get in several ways. One of which, of course, is by loading up a brush and then smacking the ferrule against your hand, and then all the paint will sort of disperse itself like that. You can also use your fingers and literally push as you would like with a toothbrush. You push the bristles back and then release them, and they'll do that spray. But something that probably, as Mr. Adams says, would not work on a vertical. So
I just want to mention really quickly, there's one thing I don't think any of us have talked about thus far, which I noticed with this, but I've also been noticing in a lot of the ones that we've looked at today.
I know what you're going to say.
Do you? What is it?
It's not about shoes, is it?
No, it's not about shoes. It's about the fact that outside of the subject, the rest of the canvas is very spare. You know, the bed, the just the suggestion of the room there. It's very spare kind of spaces that these people are, and in a strange way, there's something quite mid-century modern about that. Like the settings that they're sitting in are very. I don't know, they remind me of like mid-century modern furniture.
And the furniture, you've got like these cheap folding beds that you see, the sofa beds that you see again and again. You see these sort of the modern sofas in units. You know, remember that sort of circular one that's surrounding George Dyer, who's crouching. And these are very much taken from furniture catalogues and what he was seeing in furniture showrooms in the 1960s. So they are very modern. You know, plain walls as well. You're not seeing any wallpaper. You're not seeing stripes, which you found commonly in the Edwardian period and so forth. So yeah, I mean, the decor and the clothing is highly modern. It's of the period.
I mean,
and you get that strange sort of light aqua high pile carpet, wall carpet on the wall there.
I was going to say, like, somebody, I can't remember if it was the first stream or the second stream, but somebody mentioned Dali. And I would say, like, the difference between looking at this, where it's so spare, and looking at Dali is like, in Dali you can like look at the thing and spot little details, or what's going on over there in the background, and I mean, there's none of that with Bacon. It's all about the kind of subject at the centre. You know, your eyes would only wander and kind of consider the border if you're kind of weird like me.
And it's like a stage set, and this is something that emphasised the existential readings, and particularly in the 1950s with the sort of black spaces. But I mean, it does also apply to the 1960s as well.
Yeah, and the idea of the room, of course, in dramatic, in drama, in the play. If you think of like the Pinter and the idea of the room,
and also so the bedsit in the hotel room as well, very very sparse.
Interesting. Okay. Was there something about shoes you wanted to mention, Dee?
It will come up later on, but there's a curious, especially with some of the 70s and 80s self-portraits. There's a curious and very specific type of shoe that you see, which of course you also see in photographs of Bacon. He wore these. I don't actually know what they are. Very curious. They sort of look like brogues, but they're not. Anyway, we'll see that in the 70s next time. So, and we'll look. This is the last picture we'll look at before we see that video show aside. But this is a three studies for a self-portrait from 1967.
The one on the left almost looks like one of those African masks, you know the African.
Yeah, it's a very, very curious thing going on here.
Also, remember that many of the photographs that were found in Bacon's studio were from sports and especially boxing, and so you had a lot of photographs of faces distorted because they were actually being struck. And so you see these sort of strange sort of open mouths and twisted lips. And
I mean, that's what really struck me earlier on when we were looking at the Dyer ones, is that Dyer, his portraits of Dyer always look like he's been in a boxing match or in the end of a kind of Rocky Punch show or something, you know, twisted noses and all that. Yeah.
Telling. This one, of course, the panel on the right, this is another one where we have a real explicit reference to a source, which you can see in the next slide.
Oh.
So this is as you can see, a facial injury. I can't remember the nature of this, which this man has lost most of his face. But
I should imagine that's a war injury, isn't it? So
yeah. And so this would have been a specific reference for that sort of panel on the right hand side of the picture.
Oh, horrific! Can't imagine living.
Yeah.
With most of your face missing like that.
Yeah.
I think that's something that people forget. That, you know, in people who lived in the sort of the 20s and 30s, they were sort of semi-accustomed to seeing people with incredible, severe wounds, astonishing things. I mean, obviously, you had the growth of prosthetics and so forth, but that sort of stuff was not beyond the realms of daily encounters.
Amputation.
And I think this is something that I said in a previous stream, but I think that the people who are war hawks and who are sort of encouraging certain wars to go on right to the bitter end, even though perhaps they're not feasible or fightable, they should think about these sort of consequences.
Well, you know, again, it's almost as if the late 20th century was about the kind of burying of anything of this nature, anything to remind people of aspects of these sort of grim aspects and outcomes of their easily chaired on policy from the comfort of their future chairs. So yeah, we don't tend to see the consequences of our actions any longer. Okay, well, somehow you found the right video. That's the one I wanted to look at. So
hi IQD. All right, so shall we play this one? Okay.
Yeah.
Do you want to ask me about my politics? Well, if you want to ask them about it, I have always voted for people where I thought they would make the freedom that my life would be as free as possible. That's the only reason. I haven't got any very strong political feelings. I haven't got any political feelings at all. I just want the best kind of atmosphere in which to work. And so I have tended to vote to the right, I think, because they're less idealistic than the left, and therefore one will be left freer. One won't be encumbered by the idealism of the left, so therefore I tended to vote always right.
Good.
Because I always feel that the right, for me, is the best of a bad job.
I've also felt about you that it wasn't just that because it suited you economically to vote right, but also that in a way the idealism of the left was in fact possibly morally questionable for you, because I really do think that you have a profound belief in the importance of chance, therefore the importance of injustice and unevenness as positive things, and that egalitarianism, which tends to rectify the way the cards are dealt, is actually, in a way, kind of abhorrent to you as a principle.
Well, it is, because I certainly don't believe in equality. Some people are born with greater gifts than others. Some people are born better looking than others. Certain women are born more beautiful than others. And they're going to have greater chances just for those very reasons. And so I have no belief in equality. I do believe in one thing, that people should, when it's possible, be given equal opportunity. But even when they're given equal opportunity, very few people will be able to avail themselves of it.
I mean, that is basically the essence of left and right there, because I think equality is the dividing line, really. Hierarchy or inequality, or the fundamental belief in inequality and the defense of inequality as a natural and just principle is basically the essence of what we call left and right today. I kind of find it interesting because we mentioned Burroughs earlier. I seem to remember Burroughs had I'm not sure if he talked about the equality part, but he was also basically libertarian, where like he wanted to be left alone to be able to get on with his work. So I wonder how much that kind of goes hand in hand a lot of time with art. If you're an artist, you don't want the state dictating what you can say or do. So there's a kind of natural libertarianism that may go hand in hand with it. I don't know.
Yes and no. I mean, it's a big subject. There are certain artists who did embrace communism. There were some who sort of strategically embraced it. There were some who like Picasso, kind of did it as a nod towards humanitarianism, where he actually, you look at his life and his thoughts and the way he expressed himself, he really didn't actually believe in egalitarianism, but he just wanted to sort of, tip his
Certainly
hat.
wasn't a feminist.
No, certainly wasn't. So it's a big thing, but Burroughs and libertarianism, I think, is it's a good subject for a stream.
And I think, of course, the from that statement that Bacon made, I mean, that is also a fundamental truth that people must realize, is that you can't have art without inequality. You can't have art in a situation that forces egalitarianism, because of course then, I mean, it's this whole no judgment. Well, there is, without judgment there isn't art, there isn't civilization. It's all about this entire building a system which acknowledges the inequality of everything and the hierarchy of everything. And again, without this, there just is no art. There's just this sludge. There's just this sludge of self-expression, mostly from people who have nothing to express. So, and I think this is something that people, I'm always trying to get people on the right to think about art in a different way, beyond this idea of trad and degenerate or modern
there's something else as well, though, which is in the socialist imagination and the Marxist imagination, when the utopia comes, they all imagine themselves that they are all going to be artists or something like that, don't they? In the communist utopia, nobody thinks they're going to be sweeping the streets. They all think they're going to be an artist. But of course, the reality is that that's never going to happen, even in communism.
Well, it's this. I mean, it's still even beyond that. Just this modern idea that children should be taught to express themselves, and no. As I said, most people have nothing to express. I view art as an entirely elitist, aspect of life. Now, of course, the product of the artist can then the artist as a person who is capable through their talents and through their vision of creating extraordinary things, can then inspire lower people, lesser people, to have thoughts that that they may not be able to conjure themselves, or images or visions or philosophies of life. I'm not just talking about visual arts, any arts. But I think you have to accept this as a fundamental condition of life, and it does not imply that there is any one way of doing this, that there's one sort of trad way of doing this, and in fact I think that one of the biggest mistakes of the right is to let culture be taken over by the left, in the way that it has. To isolate oneself in the past in a certain way, and seed art to terrible people.
But I also think it's worth drawing attention to the fact that so many of these figures that we've talked, I mean, we talked about this on the T.S. Eliot stream as well, were actually men of the right. And I think that there's a reflexive assumption that all artists are left-wing.
This is something that Bowden talks about, and especially if you look at the men of 1914, when people go back to our stream on Wyndham Lewis, you'll see that Wyndham Lewis, Eliot, and Hume and so forth, Pound especially, were men of the right, and they were avant-gardists, they were vanguardists, but the idea that the vanguardism is a product of the left or progressivism, and not necessarily, also an attribute of the reactionary. And people should go and listen to Bowden's lectures.
He has got a lecture on modern art, I seem to remember.
He's got lots. There's a whole book, book that he published on it. Well, that have been collected of his lectures. I can't remember what it's called now. I've got it here. I can't actually see the title. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right. Well, there are a couple of super chats before we get out of here. Mighty Sebastian says AA doesn't want to know what happens in the U.S. Marines. Let's just say a certain behaviour is notorious even among the married. I believe it. I actually do not believe this idea, and this is going to come back to haunt me, I'm sure, but I'm not sure that the modern idea that people are just like, oh, this guy was born gay, this guy was born straight. I'm not sure if that is necessarily true, and I'm not even sure if how can I put it? I'm not even sure if let's say the sex that goes on between the US Marines is the same thing as the sex that people might have with their wife. I think they may be tapping into different parts of nature.
Tapping into different parts, indeed.
yeah, like quite literally. Yeah.
Well, as you said, but of course, again, you there's other manifestations of power and dominance that come into play. And and of course we know that there's also this whole area of of different types of sexual activity in certain circumstances, such as in prisons or in militaries. Certainly in the past. I mean, the whole idea that we describe the Royal Navy as rum, sodomy, and the lash. Or there was an Apostolic Majesty stream where they discussed this, but there was a certain part of Italian history where you have people literally, you have commanders literally shagging their prisoners, in front of their men as a display of power.
There's a I don't know if anybody watched the recent Game of Thrones series. I forgot what it's called now. The one. It was like a prequel to Game of Thrones. About the king. What's it bloody called? The House. Oh, I don't know. But
House of the Dragon.
The House of the Dragon. One of the things, and this is where I think the kind of reflexive populism often misses something. They misappropriate something, right? Which is that in that there's a group of guys who are like seafaring guys and they love adventure and all that sort of stuff, but there's a whole plot line where one of like the son of like the leader of these has to marry, is betrothed to one of the princesses, but the trouble is that he likes men, basically, and the whole thing is that he just wants to get back to his swashbuckling adventures, where also he does a bit of jolly rogering, right? And I thought that there was an interesting, like, a lot of people at the time were like, oh, this is just woke subversion and all that sort of stuff. I was thinking, actually, there's probably something to this. The idea that the brotherhood, the camaraderie of that brotherhood then has this other dimension, and that's kind of always gone on in a way. It's I mean, it's something that people don't like to talk about. I mean, I think Bronze Age perverts talked about it numerous times, but I just don't see any point in denying that has always happened. I just don't like. This is something that goes on. So why do we pretend otherwise? Yeah.
Now, of course, I mean, this is not. I think the mistake in the other direction is to assume that all sort of homosocial sort of activity always had this sexual dimension, which is not certainly not true either. But it's just folly to sort of deny this, and and also, I mean, that not to get into it, but this is again why I've just always rejected this idea of this whole concept of gay, and this idea of viewing it as an identity, and idea of viewing it as analogous to a male-female relationship. It isn't. This is why I never supported gay marriage. It is a different thing. It's a different sort of activity for in different situations, and I think the mistake is sort of equivocating it and turning it again into this political and personal identity. Ridiculous.
Yeah, I mean, I also think though that, to be serious for a moment, there is a difference between bourgeois morality that is designed essentially to promulgate civilizational values, right? And the values of what you might call the frontier or the adventure or the band of brothers, which is very much comes out of the kind of warrior spirit. I think those two things are those two moral. They develop for different reasons, in my opinion. So the values of the warrior types or the adventurer types are never going to be those of the bourgeois morality that basically wants you to be Hank Hill, right? And I think that these two, on the right, these two different sets of values often conflict with each other in all sorts of, and I mean, it plays in modernity. It plays out with Bronze Age pervert arguing with trads, right? But I think that's what's actually going on, and that they actually have different social and civilizational functions. Because I mean, if you had a group of Hank Hills trying to bloody, I don't know, we were talking about Africa yesterday, D. Can you imagine trying to do all of that stuff, thinking like a kind of, thinking like a normal bourgeois? It just wouldn't. You couldn't do it. You have to have a different sense, I guess. So, anyway.
And I think different things are required of men at different times. I mean, it's seen very painfully in what happened in World War I and World War II. That men went off into this entirely different way of being in the world, where they were exposed to and expected to kill, and exposed to extraordinarily suffering and death and all sorts of horrors, and then of course are brought back and expected to then slot neatly into polite bourgeois family life.
And I mean, one of the tragedies of the two world wars, right? And I'm not trying to be disrespectful to anyone whose grandparents or great grandparents served in that, is of course they were mass wars, and a lot of those people who were just drafted really were not of the warrior type that we're talking about.
No, they weren't warriors at all.
Right, they were just people just picked up and plonked in the trenches or whatever, which is again a very different thing.
That's the effect of conscription, isn't it?
Yeah,
that's
it's probably something Younger talks about somewhere. Anyway, let us carry on. Machiavelli Sucks to Go says, without straight white males, this world could not function.
I don't think anyone disputed that.
I mean, I don't think anybody says that's not true. Caro Kadisat Twin says, thanks for these art streams. Although there is a different side, and maybe I'll talk about this more when Prophets of Doom comes out, is that the fight the Conservatives have been having for the past 75 years, I think is a fight to maintain the civilization that you want to keep on going, right? But as that civilization declines and degrades more, the stripe of men who are going to be required to do what is necessary to rectify it is not going to come from those civilizational bourgeois values. It's going to have to come from, if you want to take Bowden, it's going to have to come from men of a more extreme stripe, who, by their very nature and psychology, are not going to be Hank Hills. They're going to be a very different type of guy. So.
Exactly. Yeah. So the ideal presented by certain sections of the right is not a man. The family man. The provider, the farmer, the father, is not necessarily the man who is able to defend the civilization that's in peril. And of course, then from the other side, you have the literally regime creating the conditions for men of a more extreme character to rise up. So.
Mighty Sebastian says it happened, and I'm not suggesting, by the way, before anybody, because everybody's so crude and reductive, that all men of that stripe are also gay. I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying that they're not going to fit more. They're not going to be easily constrained by the sort of bourgeois morality required of an office worker who has a polite family. It's just a different thing.
Yeah, these are also not going to be the men who just say, love is love, and in this house we believe in, trans rights. I mean, it's not going to be those.
This is often what has been talked of in terms of the cycles of civilization. That you have your frontiers people, and then the people who come afterwards. They're the civilizers, and it's inevitable that these cycles come. But it's inevitable that the outcome is, decadence and weakness, and then sort of deracination.
Yeah, it's like that meme of, rough times create hard men, that. Also, I just figured out Cowcut is a twin, is an Aphex twin track. So trying to figure out what that username was that gave Superman.
He says, do you have any recommendations for painters or artists who are still alive?
Yes. Yeah. I have to get into that elsewhere, because I'd really have to think about it. Yeah, I'll think about it and maybe talk about that on X.
Feel free to mention my name at any time.
Yeah, I mean, for instance, there's both of us. I mean, I'm
yes.
Unfortunately can't dox myself.
Yes, I've not seen Mr. D's work, so I can't recommend it, but I suspect it's very good.
Mighty Sebastian says it happens in Saudi Arabia for similar reasons. I'm guessing he's talking about what we were talking about just now.
All over the Islamic world, I'm afraid. Yeah.
There's all. I mean, we won't get into it. There's also quite a lot of straight buggery that goes on in that part of the world because of the strictures purity about the hymen and all that. So they get up to it that way. Okay, all right. Well, Mr. Adams, anything you'd like to promote before we get out of here?
Well, yes. Just if anyone's interested, follow the links in the link tree in the description, and also consider subscribing on my Substack and buy my prints and invest in a rising artist.
I'll just mention again, my courses are available. The merit code is working. Pick up Foundations of Writing. If you do the Trivium, start with Foundations of Writing. I always tell people to do that. There is the research one as well. That's just kind of cheap and useful. So try to get that too. D, anything you want to mention before we get out of here?
No, follow me on Twitter, aka X, if you want, and stay tuned, of course, for part the fourth.
Don't call it part.
No, wait, sorry. For the next installment, I don't know what kind. I sort of hurriedly came up with the laughable title of this one, but I don't know what it'll be. You know, Fame and Horror. Now next week. You know,
Francis Bacon and Flares. Into the 70s.
Into the 70s, yeah. You know, leather and lasciviousness. I don't know.
All right, get out, everybody, get out.
What goes on in this town is none of your business.
As long as I'm living here, it is.
Then maybe you shouldn't be living here!
Well, that's easily fixed.